What's up, everybody? This is Jason, and you're listening to the Unsung Podcast. This is part 6 of American Guerrillas, an ongoing series covering Bleeding Kansas and the Kansas-Missouri border war. This is one continuous narrative, so you will want to go back and listen to the previous parts if you haven't already. And before we get started today, I have a public apology to make because, you see, I've been exposed as a fraud. Yes, friends, I come to you, hat in hand, asking, nay, begging your forgiveness. You see, in part 5, I made an analogy which involved saying that the Kansas City Chiefs are the best team in the NFL. That episode was released during the week leading up to Super Bowl 59, and let's just say that statement didn't age very well. So if that ruins my credibility for you, and you never want to listen to this podcast again, I understand. For everybody else, if you still like this show, please consider subscribing to my Substack for $5 a month or $50 a year. There's a link to that in the show notes. That gets you access to bonus episodes as well as some other stuff I write on there from time to time. Originally, I planned on writing reviews of the books I'm reading for this series, but after doing a few of those, I found I don't really like writing book reviews, and I'd rather just work on the main podcast most of the time, but there are a few of those up right now. There might be more, but in any case, I'll think of something extra to put up there for the paid subscribers. There's one bonus episode of the podcast up right now, and I have ideas for a couple more. If you don't want to subscribe, you can also make a one-time donation through PayPal or Venmo. Those links are also in the show notes. I sincerely appreciate everybody who has subscribed or donated so far. It really means a lot that you guys find this show valuable enough to actually pay me for it, so thank you again, and I hope you continue to enjoy it. One more thing before we get started. I was talking to a friend of mine who listens to this show, and he thought it would be helpful to have a timeline to refer to while listening to this, to kind of help keep events in context in relation to each other. So I've made one of those, and you can check it out at the link in the show notes. It's not complete yet, and I'll keep updating it as I release more episodes, but it does show pretty thoroughly all the events I've covered in this show up through the time period covered by this episode. Might be helpful if you're a visual kind of person and you want something to look at. And that's it for the preamble, so here we go. This is American Guerrillas, Part 6.
Well, you're gonna pull those pistols or whistle Dixie. If I get to liking someone, they ain't around long.
I notice when you get to disliking someone, they ain't around for long either.
Pretty sure we have time to bury them, fellas.
Hell with them fellas. Buzzards gotta eat, same as worms.
In the late 5th century BC, the two most powerful city-states in the Greek world at that time, Athens and Sparta, went to war with each other, along with all their allies and colonies and subject states. This Peloponnesian War lasted 27 years and devastated the Greek world. Nothing would be the same after this. About 10 years into the war, the two sides signed a peace treaty that would calm things for a while but ultimately turn out to be only a temporary truce. At this point, the Spartans had suffered some significant setbacks. They were losing, and it was them who were suing for peace. The ancient Athenian historian Thucydides records what was said in the negotiations for this treaty. In Book 4 of his History of the War, he records the Spartan envoys as having said the following to the Athenians. Quote, "If peace was ever desirable for both parties, it is surely so at the present moment. Before anything irremediable befall us and force us to hate you eternally, personally as well as politically, and you to miss the advantages that we now offer you." End quote. What exactly can two peoples do to each other which is irremediable? I think it's safe to say it's not just fighting battles or fighting wars. Different Greek city-states had been fighting battles with each other for hundreds of years before the Peloponnesian War. There was a whole ritual to it where the two sides would fight until a clear winner was decided, which usually meant one phalanx broke formation, and then the loser would ask the winner for a truce to pick up their dead. The truce would always be granted, and the winner would set up a trophy to commemorate the victory. And that was serious stuff. I mean, it was war. People died. But it seems to me like as long as everything was conducted according to the shared rituals of the Hellenic people, there wasn't necessarily anything about that which would prevent the combatants from making peace afterward, or even allying with each other in the future against someone else. When the Persians, sometimes called the Medes, invaded Greece under King Darius in 490 BC and again under King Xerxes in 480 BC, all these squabbling city-states were able to band together and fight them off. And while some of them did Medize, meaning go over to the Persian side, there was enough of a common Greek identity or feeling of kinship between the different city-states for enough of them to ultimately get together to defeat the Persian armies and keep their independence. So among the states that banded together, whatever wars they may have fought amongst themselves prior to that, apparently nothing had happened between them to breed the kind of hatred that would have prevented them from banding together against an external enemy. In other words, they hadn't done anything irremediable to each other. But it seems to me that by the 10-year mark of the Peloponnesian War, people understood that this war was different. That there was potential here for this to escalate to the point where there would be no coming back from it. And in fact, it did. Both sides later ended up trying to work with the same Persian Empire they'd just desperately fought off 60 years before. The Athenians lost a huge combined naval and land force in an ill-conceived expedition to Sicily, which broke their naval hegemony over the eastern Mediterranean. The Athenian democracy was overthrown and replaced with an oligarchy, then restored, then dismantled and restored again after their ultimate surrender to Sparta in 404 BC. Now, I'm not at all sure where or when exactly this conflict became irremediable, but it is clear that nothing was ever the same in the Greek world after this. Both sides were bled down and weakened, and as the 4th century BC wore on, their power faded to the point where both were conquered and subjugated by the Macedonians, Philip II and his son Alexander the Great. Why am I telling you all this? Well, the idea that caught my eye in there is this question of irremediability that the Spartan envoys bring up. Where is the line such that once it's crossed, reconciliation becomes next to impossible without some truly divinely inspired levels of forgiveness? I don't know the answer to that, but what I do know is that the outbreak of war in earnest, nationwide, in the summer of 1861, handed an excuse on a silver platter to a bunch of men who really didn't need much of an excuse in the first place. And the partisans on the Kansas-Missouri border were about to seriously test that limit of what exactly constitutes irremediable. The larger armies, both Union and Confederate, had to scramble to get organized and come up with a strategy. But the Jayhawkers of eastern Kansas knew exactly what to do. They'd already been doing it since 1857, and they were more than happy to keep it up. One Jayhawker in a camp near Kansas City would write, quote, "Kansas City is silent. The tables are turned now, and here in camp are many Kansas men who were hunted in 55 and 56 by the border ruffians who rode, booted and spurred over our state. They are now entering this state to settle up old scores and bless the world with a Christian civilization." End quote. But before we get to that, we need to back up a little bit and introduce one of the major players in the Trans-Mississippi War. I've mentioned him already, but haven't gone into any detail on his background yet. It's General Sterling Price, the commander of the Missouri State Militia that fought alongside Ben McCulloch's Confederate regulars at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. This episode is going to be a little bit out of order chronologically, but I think it'll make sense. And the reason I'm backing up now is that to understand the follow-up campaign that Price goes on after Wilson's Creek, we need to understand a bit more about Price himself and also his relationship to the Missouri Secessionists and the Confederacy. Sterling Price was born in Virginia in 1809 and moved to Missouri in 1831, where he married and became a successful tobacco planter and owner of several dozen slaves. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1844, but when war with Mexico broke out in 1846, he resigned from Congress to command a Missouri Volunteer Cavalry Regiment. He ended up stationed in New Mexico in the fall of 1846 as part of an occupation force, not seeing any action initially. Characterizing Price, Albert Castell writes in his book General Sterling Price and the Civil War in the West, quote, "In this capacity, he displayed a laxness in enforcing discipline, a tendency to quarrel with other officials, and a penchant for acting in a highly independent, almost insubordinate fashion, characteristics that were to manifest themselves in a subsequent war. At first it appeared that he would have no opportunity for active service, but suddenly in January 1847, the Pueblo Indians rose in a bloody revolt against American rule, killing the territorial governor, Charles Bent. Although caught off guard, Price displayed decisiveness and vigor in quelling the insurrection, winning a number of pitched battles at little cost to his own forces while at the same time inflicting heavy losses on the poorly armed Indians. Later on, when faced with another uprising, he led his army in a swift campaign into Mexico itself, where he gained new victories and captured the city of Chihuahua. He returned to Missouri at the end of the war with the brevet rank of brigadier general and a greatly enhanced reputation. Henceforth, he considered himself first and foremost a military man." End quote. Price went back to his plantation, but was back in Missouri politics before long, which is where he first starts to interact with our story. Castell continues, quote, "Beginning in 1849, a split developed in the Missouri Democratic Party over the slavery issue. For several years, Price avoided committing himself to either side, but ultimately, like most Missourians of his class, he joined the pro-slavery anti-Benton faction, thus causing Thomas Hart Benton to denounce him as a traitor and ingrate. In 1853, the anti-Bentonians gained control of the party and nominated him for governor. Price won the election by a substantial majority, for his war record plus his personal charm and impressive physical presence had made him, in the words of one supporter, unquestionably the most popular man in Missouri. Among his fellow politicians, he had a reputation for sagacity, secrecy, and an ability to detect a winning trend and act accordingly. However, his friends admitted he was somewhat slow of thought and speech, and a mediocre orator, and his enemies accused him of vanity and double-dealing. Price occupied the governorship during one of the most crucial periods in Missouri's history. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 opened the way for a violent and momentous struggle between North and South for control of the Kansas Territory. In this contest, Missouri, by reason of geographic proximity and political and economic interest, represented the South. Price, as might be expected, sympathized with the effort of his constituents to make Kansas a slave state. Thus, in 1855, he endorsed a resolution drawn up by a convention at Liberty which declared that if Congress refused to admit Kansas as a slave state, this would mean the destruction of the Union. and although he refrained from using his official powers to aid the Missouri border ruffians in their campaign to conquer Kansas for slavery, he did nothing as governor to restrain them or prevent their invasions of Kansas." End quote. We've been over the story from there. Price's term as governor ended in 1857, but we'll pick back up with the lead-up to Wilson's Creek. The way Castell describes the political situation within Missouri as the war kicked off is that you have two extreme minorities with a large moderate majority in the center, and that should make a lot of sense given what we've talked about before. The names he gives these factions are as follows. You have the secessionists on one extreme, led by the governor Claiborne Jackson and his lieutenant governor Thomas Reynolds. Then on the other extreme, you have what Castell calls the unconditional Unionists, led by Frank Blair and Nathaniel Lyon. And that means exactly what it sounds like. These people favored keeping Missouri in the Union at all costs, regardless of what the federal government did. The vast majority of the state's population, something like 70% judging by the 1860 election results, were the conditional Unionists. Castell describes them like this, quote, "The vast majority of Missourians early in 1861 stood between the unconditional Unionists and the secessionists. Instead, they were conditional Unionists, which meant that they were opposed to secession, but that they also believed that the federal government had no right to use force to keep states in the Union. This attitude reflected the conflicting loyalties and interests of Missouri, with its blood ties to the South and its economic links to the North, and also the fact that most of its citizens were either Douglas Democrats or old-line Whigs who held the Northern Republicans and the Southern Democrats equally responsible for disrupting the Union. Furthermore, many conditional Unionists were slaveholders, who for that very reason opposed secession. As one of their spokesmen put it, 'So long as we remain loyal, the general government is bound not only to respect but to maintain and defend our slave property. Secession, on the other hand, would bring the Canada line down to our borders and leave Missouri exposed to the Kansas murderers and bandits.' But more than anything else, most Missourians in the first weeks of 1861 hoped that somehow their state could avoid choosing between North and South and, if civil war occurred, remain neutral, thus sparing themselves and others the necessity of fighting against either side. Yet, unfortunately for this totally unrealistic desire, both the unconditional Unionists and the secessionists demanded with ever-growing impatience that Missouri take a stand one way or the other. And all the while, too, the march of events made this decision increasingly difficult to postpone." End quote. Castell calls the desire for neutrality unrealistic there, and I think he's completely right about that, unfortunately. It's one of the most predictable and also sometimes tragic things about American politics that we always seem to fall into these polarizing, oppositional situations where the uninterested people in the middle are forced to choose a side. But the thing is, I think this desire for neutrality is really only unrealistic in hindsight, because we know that this war is about to last for 4 long years and become by far the most bloody and catastrophic event in all of American history, even up through the year 2025 when I'm recording this. But you have to remember that no one knew at the time how bad it was going to get, although some people absolutely suspected it would be worse than anyone was expecting. But there wasn't necessarily anything happening yet that hadn't happened before, in kind if not in degree. There had been secession crises before, although none of the previous ones had ever gotten to the point where states were actually seceding and forming a new confederacy. And there had been armed rebellions before, as well as threats of armed rebellions that never materialized. You can easily imagine a scenario, for example, where, let's say, Bull Run goes the opposite way from how it went in real life. The Confederate Army is shattered, the Federals march onto Richmond and take it, the Confederacy falls apart, and maybe there's legal consequences for the leaders of the rebellion, but at the end of the day, the South just kind of goes home and says, well, that didn't work. Guess we have to find some other way of solving these issues, dividing the nation. How realistic that is, I don't know, but the point is, you can imagine a scenario where the war is fought mainly back east in Virginia and resolves itself in a couple of months. In a scenario like that, it might actually be feasible for a western frontier state like Missouri to just avoid choosing sides long enough to stay out of the thing. But the longer it goes on, the harder it becomes to stay out of it, and certainly by the time First Bull Run happened and everybody figured out it wasn't going to be over in a couple of months, at that point, yeah, good luck staying neutral. But we know how it goes, and the effort to determine which way Missouri would tip would revolve around the key players of the extreme factions: Jackson and Reynolds on the secessionist side, and Blair and Lyon on the Unionist side. Price in the beginning was in the moderate majority conditional Unionist group. But what shifted him firmly to the secessionist side was the St. Louis riot in May of 1861, which became known among the Missouri secessionists as the Camp Jackson Massacre. We went over that in the last episode. 28 civilians killed, including a baby. Not a good look within the state for the unconditional Unionists. Price was an eyewitness to that event, along with, weirdly enough, both Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. He was outraged by the incident, and the day after the massacre, he left St. Louis, went to Jefferson City, and offered his services to the secessionist Jackson. Jackson didn't accept his offer at first, though, because he didn't trust Price because of his Unionist opinions up to that point. It was Reynolds who convinced Jackson to accept Price and appoint him commander of the Missouri militia, arguing that having the most popular man in the state publicly come over to their side would be a great way to get the conditional Unionists to follow. But Jackson's initial mistrust of Price, unfortunately for them, set the tone for a general atmosphere of mutual mistrust between all three of these men, Jackson, Reynolds, and Price, which would really hamper their efforts at working together to accomplish their goal of secession. And figuring out their strategy going forward would be a sticky enough problem as it was. Castell writes, quote, "On May 13th, Price, Jackson, and Reynolds conferred on future strategy. Reynolds proposed that the governor exploit the universal indignation over Camp Jackson by calling on the citizenry to form military organizations. Then, if Lyon marched on Jefferson City, Jackson would order a mass uprising against him. The Union Army would be destroyed, the Southern Rights Party would gain control of the state, and the way would be open for secession." Initially, Jackson and Price agreed to this plan. Then, for a number of reasons, they changed their minds. First, Lyon was superseded by Major General William S. Harney as commander of the United States Army in Missouri. Harney upheld the action against Camp Jackson and denounced the military bill as an indirect ordinance of secession. But he was known to be more conservative than Lyon, independent of Blair, and anxious to avoid bloodshed. When approached by a group of influential Missourians, he indicated that he would be willing to enter into negotiations with Jackson and Price, and word of this was passed on to Jackson. Second, Reynolds' plan, if put into effect, almost surely would precipitate full-fledged war, and this would be disastrous at the present juncture for the secessionist cause. The 1,000 or so poorly armed, unorganized, and untrained militiamen at Jefferson City were no match for the powerful Union force at St. Louis, and it required little reflection to realize that Reynolds' idea of a mass uprising was impractical. Third, the legislature had no power to pass a secession ordinance. Only the convention could legally do this, but it was adjourned, and its members scattered all over the state. Yet until Missouri formally seceded, it remained part of the Union and subject to federal laws and authority. Fourth, secession presented an extremely difficult problem for Missouri. It was surrounded on three sides by northern states. Its principal city was held by the Unionists. It had no direct rail connections with the South. The Mississippi was closed, and the only slave state from which help could come directly, Arkansas, was very weak, and itself had not yet seceded. Thus, from a purely strategic standpoint, breaking away from the Union would be inexpedient until effective Confederate military assistance was forthcoming. And finally, popular indignation over Camp Jackson subsided rapidly, and the desire for peace and neutrality once again became the dominant feeling in Missouri. What was needed, decided Jackson and Price, was time. Time in which to organize and strengthen the state guard, time to make arrangements for Confederate military intervention, time to reassemble the convention. Therefore, in order to gain this time, they decided to enter into negotiations with Harney. They would do so in the name of maintaining Missouri's sovereignty and preserving peace, so that when war did come, as inevitably it must, the blame would fall on the Unionists. Moreover, to accomplish this end, they were prepared to make almost any concessions, promise nearly anything that would appease and lull the federal authorities and prevent a premature showdown. Or, in other words, while talking peace, they would prepare for war, and under the cloak of neutrality attempt to lead Missouri into the Confederacy. Obviously, it was a strategy in which reasons of expediency prevailed over considerations of morality. Whether it would be sanctioned by success remained to be seen. End quote. So this is how Castell characterizes Jackson's professed desire for neutrality. He absolutely wanted to secede in the end, but was playing for time, basically. I didn't really go over this at all in the last episode, and there seems to be some debate among historians about that, but I have no particular reason to doubt Castell on it. And it does add some context to that negotiation between Jackson and Lyon, doesn't it? We'll get to that in a minute, but as of May, Harney was still in command of the federal troops in Missouri. He hadn't been relieved yet. And on May 21st, Harney actually signed an agreement with Price, which said that Price would use the militia to maintain order within the state, and Harney would not make any aggressive military movements with federal forces. Harney up to now might look like a bit of a rube, playing right into the hand of Jackson and allowing him to gain the time he wanted. But Harney wasn't stupid, and he had his own reasons for negotiating and coming to this kind of agreement. Castell writes, quote, Jackson's and Price's motives in making an agreement with Harney have already been described. As for Harney, he was aware of the great excitement aroused by the Camp Jackson affair and realized that further military action would plunge Missouri into civil war. In his estimation, Missouri could be kept in the Union by a firm but conciliatory policy in which force would be used only when strictly necessary. The agreement with Price, he believed, would reassure and calm the people, weaken the secessionists, and set the stage for a gradual, peaceful establishment of Union control. Thus, like Jackson and Price, but for a diametrically different reason, he sought to gain time. End quote. We know that didn't work out for him. Harney was relieved and replaced with Lyon, and we already know about the negotiation between Lyon and Jackson. Now, I speculated a little bit in the last episode about how things might have gone if anybody other than Lyon had been in that negotiation, and the important context here is that before the negotiation took place, Lyon and Blair had already kind of sussed out what Jackson was up to. They knew he really wanted secession and not just neutrality. They knew he was trying to play for time, and the stance Lyon took makes quite a bit more sense in light of that. But be that as it may, Lyon was definitely a hothead. After all, he did pop off and tell Jackson that he'd sooner see every man, woman, and child in Missouri dead than see the federal government make any concessions at all to the state. And even if he might have just said that for dramatic effect and didn't really mean it literally, even then, that doesn't exactly sound like the kind of thing a cool-headed, even-keeled guy would say, does it? I can just picture Lyon going into that negotiation, this little red-headed, aggressive ball of energy, thinking, I know exactly what you're up to, Jackson, you son of a bitch, and I'm not going to let you get away with it. So the interesting what-if here, I think, is actually what happens if the Unionists go with Harney's approach instead of Lyon's. At the end of the day, we'll never find out because Harney got relieved and Lyon took over. Castell sums it up like this, quote, most historians, of whom Edward Conrad Smith and Allen Nevins are conspicuous examples, have accepted Harney's assessment of the situation in Missouri in the late spring of 1861, and hence have been highly critical of Blair and Lyon, even going so far as to blame them for all the subsequent woes of the state. However, besides making the dubious assumption that Jackson and Price were sincere in their neutrality professions, they overlook, as did Harney, the simple fact that it was not enough merely to keep Missouri in the Union, that instead, given its wealth, population, and geographic position, it was absolutely necessary that Missouri participate actively on the side of the North in the war, something it most obviously would never have done so long as Jackson and the pro-Southern legislature remained in power at Jefferson City. nor is there much point to the corollary argument that Union control could have been established gradually. Blair and Lyon, unlike 20th century historians, did not know in the spring of 1861 that the Civil War was scheduled to run 4 years. Most likely they thought, as did other Americans at the time, that it would be won or lost before the summer was over. End quote. As for Price, he stayed on with Jackson and Reynolds and continued as commander of the Missouri militia. And here's the thing to remember as we go forward. Later in this episode, we'll come back to Price's follow-up campaign after Wilson's Creek, and his relationship to Jackson and Reynolds, as well as his former history as a conditional Unionist and his relationship to secessionism in general, will all affect what happens during that campaign. And one of the factors in all that is this general atmosphere of mutual mistrust between Jackson, Reynolds, and Price. I won't go into a ton of detail on this, but the general point is that they're all keeping secrets from each other all the time, even as they're supposedly working together to accomplish Missouri secession. For example, before the meeting with Harney, Price sent Reynolds on a mission to Richmond to try to secure Confederate military aid, but in the interest of OPSEC or something, they both kept this a secret from Jackson. Meanwhile, Price went to meet with Harney and made this agreement with him, and he had Jackson's blessing to do that, but Reynolds was out of state and didn't know this was planned. He already suspected Price of still being a closet Unionist, so when he heard about the meeting with Harney, he got even more suspicious of Price. The whole thing is like the plot of some absurd comedy of errors. It's ridiculous. Castell quotes another historian, Arthur Roy Kirkpatrick, who wrote, quote, "It is indeed a strange and, for them, unfortunate thing that these men who were so passionately devoted to the same cause felt it necessary to keep so many of their actions secret from each other, while their only hope for success lay in complete understanding and in concerted planning and action." End quote. For better or worse, Lyon forced Jackson's hand into openly declaring his intent for secession before he really wanted to, and the fight was on. We know how it went from there. Lyon marched out of St. Louis, took Jefferson City, and brushed aside the hastily thrown together Missouri militia defending Boonville. During this time, Castell says Price was suffering from a flare-up of the cholera he'd contracted in Mexico and wasn't able to take the field himself. Price's plan was originally to try to hold his line on the Missouri River, but because the recruits he was gathering were so raw and untrained, and also because Lyon moved so aggressively against him, this turned into a delaying operation. He'd hold the line as long as possible, gather as many recruits as possible, then abandon the river and retreat south to regroup and hopefully gain Confederate support for a counteroffensive. And that is what happened eventually, but this is also the time when Price met the regular Confederate general Ben McCulloch, commanding Confederate forces in northern Arkansas. McCulloch was at first not authorized by the Confederate government to enter Missouri, which might sound surprising, but makes some sense given the Confederacy's overall strategy of being on the strategic defensive. From the beginning, this war was an uphill battle for the Confederacy, and many in the government realized that if they were to win this war and gain their independence, ultimately they would need international help, much like the fledgling United States had needed help from France to gain its independence. To that end, the Confederate government needed the Union to be seen as the aggressors by the international community, in particular France and Britain, and so invading Union territory would not be a very good look for the Confederacy from a geopolitical standpoint. And since Missouri had not yet seceded from the Union of its own accord, the Confederate government didn't want McCulloch marching in there and looking like he was trying to conquer the place. When Jackson sent a messenger to Richmond asking for Confederate support, Jefferson Davis told him he couldn't even deal with Jackson unless Missouri seceded first. All that means that the military situation for the Missouri secessionists prior to Wilson's Creek was not looking very good. Castell sums it up like this, quote, "Quite clearly, the first round of the war in Missouri had gone to the Federals. They now controlled the wealthy northern and central areas, all the principal towns including the capital, and the Missouri River and the railroads. The pro-Confederates, on the other hand, had been deprived of their main source of recruits and were reduced to a few thousand ill-armed and penniless fugitives. The state treasury was scattered about in various local banks and so in Union possession, now forced into the poor and thinly populated Ozark country. Furthermore, Jackson's proclamation calling for resistance to Union military force, instead of producing a mass uprising against federal invasion, had caused such influential conservative newspapers as the St. Louis Republican to denounce him for plunging the state into war. But most important of all, and basic to the entire subsequent war in Missouri and the West, most Missourians, when at last compelled to make a choice, either rallied to the Union or else were cowed into quiescence by the speed, vigor, and success of Lyon's operations. Only a minority were prepared to give active support to the state government and the Confederacy, and but a small portion of this minority was in a position to do so. Price's force at Cowskin Prairie numbered a mere 7,000 or 8,000 men. Almost without exception, they lacked uniforms, tents, and the other ordinary military accoutrements. Moreover, they were unorganized, undisciplined, and untrained. In fact, several thousand of them were even unarmed. The rest considered themselves lucky to possess the shotguns and squirrel rifles they had brought from their homes. There were only 7 small-caliber smoothbore field pieces. Price set to work to convert this mob into an army as quickly as possible. He was aided by the fact that he had good human raw materials with which to work. All of his troops had taken up arms, at least figuratively, out of the strong and sincere conviction that the sovereignty of their state had been wantonly violated, and that their own rights and liberties were in danger. According to one of their number, among them all there was not a man who had come forth to fight for slavery. By and large, they were young, hardy men of middle-class farming families, intelligent, and in many instances well-educated. Given proper training, adequate weapons, and good leadership, they would be excellent soldiers. Nor were all of them inexperienced in warfare. Some of the older men had served in Mexico under Doniphan and Price. Others had ridden with the border ruffians in Kansas, and a number had fought the Indians on the Great Plains. Such veterans as these, plus the sprinkling of former regular Army officers such as Little, provided the cadres needed to drill and instruct the others. Indeed, the strength of the State Guard lay in the rank and file, whereas its greatest weakness was the fact that few of its numerous colonels and generals possessed military training. Marmaduke soon left in quest of a Confederate commission, or had any previous experience in commanding large forces in combat, except Price himself. End quote. Jefferson Davis did somewhat reconsider his policy towards Missouri, and he authorized McCulloch to enter Missouri with his army, but only to the extent that he judged it necessary to accomplish his primary mission of securing Arkansas and the Indian Territory for the Confederacy. So McCulloch did enter Missouri to deal with this army of Lyons before it got any stronger and was able to threaten Arkansas, and he ended up participating at Wilson's Creek. But here's the dynamic that will affect the campaign going forward from that battle. McCulloch is a Confederate regular, given the task primarily of defending Arkansas and the Indian Territory, not of conquering Missouri for the Confederacy. Price, at this point, is a Missouri militia officer with an interest in securing the secession of Missouri and bringing it over to the Confederacy. These are very different objectives that happen to align enough for these 2 men and their armies to fight alongside each other at Wilson's Creek, but that doesn't necessarily mean they'll continue to align. And besides the divergence of objectives, some personal animosity started to develop between Price and McCulloch during the lead-up to the battle as well. McCulloch complained of a lack of discipline and generally shoddy quality in the Missouri Volunteers, and Price grew increasingly frustrated over McCulloch's apparent reluctance to attack Lyon's army, which McCulloch justified by saying that Price's cavalry wasn't giving him adequate intelligence about the enemy. That divergence in objectives, as well as the more personal rivalry, will set the tone for what comes next in the campaign. As for Wilson's Creek itself, Castell sums it up like this, quote, "Lyon deserved credit for daring and determination, but not for judgment. He divided his army in the face of a much superior foe in order to attempt with inexperienced officers and troops one of the most difficult maneuvers in warfare, a coordinated attack from two widely separated directions. He would have done much better to have carried out his original plan of falling on the Confederates with his full force, cutting them up, then retiring to Springfield. As for McCulloch and Price, they displayed courage, steadiness, and resourcefulness in a time of crisis, but they had been outgeneraled by Lyon and owed their success mainly to luck and superior numbers. All in all, it was a soldier's fight, and the side with the most soldiers won it. The consequences of the battle were thus. Lyon, the most able and dynamic Federal leader in the West, had been killed. His army, although escaping destruction, ceased for the moment to be a factor in the war. Union prestige suffered a damaging blow, and Southern morale, already soaring as a result of Bull Run, rose even higher. And, of greatest importance, all of western Missouri now lay open to the victory-flushed troops of McCulloch and Price, and the tide of the war in the West had been reversed. End quote. We'll see later what Price and McCulloch did with their victory, but for now, with all these political machinations going on, I want to call your attention back to the theme I'm harping on for this whole series. Ask yourself, in all of this, who is looking out for the actual interests of the people of Missouri? I would argue basically no one. Because unrealistic though it may have been, there's little doubt in my mind that if you could just wave a magic wand and pick a stance, neutrality would have been hands down the best option for Missouri. I'm no geopolitical strategist or economist, but it seems to me that not having your land ravaged by a bitter civil war is a pretty good start to maintaining a prosperous and wholesome society. But for a nation supposedly governed by and for the people, politics in America can often be pretty indifferent and even downright hostile to the actual best interest of the people. And there are really no significant political players in the state even trying to aim for neutrality. Missouri, along with its people, has become a political football for these warring factions at this point, and the people who bear the brunt of the consequences are going to be the 70% of the population who wanted nothing to do with this war in the first place. And to be fair, there's probably not much anyone could have done at this point to stop the slide. There was no way the federal government was going to allow Missouri to stay neutral for long, even if Jackson and Reynolds had sincerely wanted that. For states to remain neutral officially sounds like something that would happen in the Peloponnesian War, where the Greek world had never had any central government to begin with, but was more of a loose collection of city-states bound together by a common language and culture, but each having its own government, alliances, and enemies. Well, go back to that tension we talked about in Part 1 with respect to centralization versus state autonomy. I said I think that is what this war is about on a deeper level than it ever was about slavery, and I think you can see it here. Just to allow for the possibility of a state remaining neutral would be to acknowledge a situation where a state's primary loyalty and responsibility is to itself and its own people. And that is the situation you see at the American founding and for decades afterwards. But we're now seeing the culmination of a decades-long push toward centralization, and the forces of centralization in the federal government, headed by Lincoln, need to change the perception so that a state's primary loyalty and responsibility is not to itself but to the federal government. The United States will no longer be a collection of semi-autonomous entities bound together by a common language and heritage, but a single entity bound together by a national identity and divided up into regions with their own local flavors and particularities. For Lincoln and the federal government, to allow Missouri to stay neutral would be like the hand saying to the brain, "No, I don't want to throw that punch," and the brain just saying, "Okay," and going along with it. And if Missouri had wanted to show the middle finger to the feds and stay neutral anyway, well, if the feds are willing to use force to bring you to heel and get you back on side, and they obviously are, if you want to keep your neutrality, you're going to have to use force to defend it. And there's no way Missouri would be able to do that successfully without Confederate military assistance, so what we're calling neutrality actually entails joining the Confederacy, almost by necessity. This is how people are forced into choosing sides and stepping into the American dialectic. Besides the political considerations, we're well down the slippery slope. The dogs of war are off the leash, and the political players are as much at the mercy of forces beyond their control as anyone else. The ancient Greeks and Romans conceived of war itself as a god, as a real spiritual being that influenced events in the world and couldn't be controlled by mere mortals but only propitiated. The Orthodox Christians don't discount the existence of beings like that. We don't just write them off as myths or silly superstitions. There's a psalm that says, "The gods of the nations are demons." They're not false gods in the sense that they don't exist. They're false gods in the sense that they're not proper objects of worship. They're malevolent and seek to destroy the good things that the true God made. And let's just say that if there was a being like Ares or Mars at work in Missouri in 1860 and 61, I wouldn't be one bit surprised. And even without the involvement of any ancient pagan deities, there was at least one other all-too-human force beyond the Missourians' control operating in the state. By the time the Battle of Wilson's Creek was fought, western Missouri was already starting to go up in flames at the hands of those Kansas Jayhawkers who were about to test the limits of remediability. And whether secession became a reality for Missouri or not, the Jayhawkers had 5 years' worth of pent-up rage to take out on their hated enemies. As the secession crisis ramped up and war broke out, public sentiment within Kansas was overwhelmingly pro-Union and pro-North. But interestingly enough, it was not overwhelmingly abolitionist. Although the political leadership class was disproportionately Northeastern and abolitionist, the general population was not. There's another book of Albert Castell's which is really good on this period. Depending on the edition you're looking at, it's called either Civil War Kansas Reaping the Whirlwind or A Frontier State at War, Kansas 1861 to 1865. I know that because I bought both, thinking they were two different books, and then found out they were two editions of the same book. But anyway, Castell writes, quote, "A notable feature of Kansas newspaper comment on the outbreak of the war was the almost total absence of any contention that its purpose was to eradicate slavery. The only crusade the editors preached was the preservation of the Union and the punishment of the Southern fanatics. They regarded slavery as the prime cause, but not the basic issue, of the irrepressible conflict. Even Webb Wilder, although declaring that civil war will end slavery, stated that the object of the war was the maintenance of the Constitution and the preservation of liberty. The arch-radical Martin Conway was practically alone among Kansans in suggesting that the South be allowed to secede in order to rid the nation of the sin of slavery. In short, the attitude of the people of Kansas in 1861 toward slavery was not what the contemporary and historical reputation of the state would seem to indicate. One of the byproducts of the propaganda that accompanied the Kansas territorial struggle was the myth that the typical Kansan of the period was a zealous abolitionist. Northern orators such as Charles Sumner and Wendell Phillips, and radical journalists such as William Phillips, Richard Josiah Hinton, and William P. Tomlinson portrayed the Free State settlers as embattled crusaders fighting to prevent the conquest of Kansas by the wicked and repulsive myrmidons of the slave power. Southern spokesmen, on the other hand, fulminated about abolitionist hordes pouring into Kansas to deprive slaveholders of their rights and to secure a base for further onslaughts on the institutions of the South. The putative exploits of John Brown in Kansas, and especially his Harper's Ferry raid, fired the public imagination and caused people, when they thought of Kansas, to think of Potawatomi Brown, and vice versa. In fact, even to this day, Brown is popularly identified with Kansas, as is so magnificently demonstrated by John Stuart Curry's famous mural in the Capitol at Topeka. Actuality, however, differed considerably from myth. Very few of those who settled in Kansas during the 50s did so for idealistic anti-slavery reasons. Even Brown probably came to Kansas originally for no higher purpose than acquiring some land. Side note, this is me cutting in here. It's kind of a side point, but I don't know about that statement on Brown. From what I've read, I don't see how you could separate Brown's move to Kansas from his abolitionism. Like I said, just a side point, Castell doesn't say anything more about it, but just wanted to mention that. Anyway, Castell continues. The Free State men, wrote one of them, were not against slavery in the abstract, and hundreds of them had a deadly terror of being termed abolitionist, and were frightened by the mere mention of that mysterious specter, Negro equality. In general, Kansans at the time of the Civil War were as much anti-Negro as they were anti-slavery, and they were probably in large measure anti-slavery because they were anti-Negro. That is, they feared the social and economic consequences of the introduction of Negro slave labor into the state. In one important respect, however, Kansas deserved its reputation for extremism on the slavery question. Without exception, its major political and governmental leaders were abolitionists. Thus, Robinson, in his message to the 1861 legislature, declared that, if it is true that the continued existence of slavery requires the destruction of the Union, it is time to ask if the existence of the Union does not require the destruction of slavery. Pomeroy and Lane, in July 1861, called on the Senate to institute immediate, unqualified, and uncompensated emancipation. Conway was perhaps the most rabid abolitionist in the nation, and late in 1862 and early in 1863 delivered sensational speeches before Congress in which he advocated what he suggested at the beginning of the war, the Wendell Phillips doctrine of granting the Confederacy independence as a means of liberating the slaves, for fear that there would be a restoration of the Union with slavery. Robinson, Pomeroy, Lane, and Conway probably represented in varying degrees the views of the majority of Kansans on slavery. With such men as the latter three serving as its national spokesmen, it is little wonder that Kansas was reputed to be the most radical of the states. End quote. Kansans watched all the political goings-on in Missouri in early 1861 with interest, knowing that whatever happened would have direct bearing on the situation of their own state. If Missouri's location made it somewhat isolated from the Confederacy, then if Missouri were to secede and join the Confederacy, Kansas would be even more isolated than that from the rest of the North, and many Kansans naturally worried about invasion from Missouri in that case as well. When Claiborne Jackson declared that he would not fulfill Lincoln's call for volunteers and called on Missourians to resist federal rule, Charles Robinson took that as tantamount to a declaration of war and called on Kansans to form military organizations for defense, which they'd actually already been doing. Now, it should come as no surprise that Jayhawkers often came from the most radical of the radical abolitionists. There were a variety of views among abolitionists as to the best method of abolishing slavery, and naturally the ones who advocated for the strategy of making slavery untenable through direct, violent action are the ones who became Jayhawkers. Then you had, of course, the opportunists and bandits who were in it for the plunder. And those two groups are really embodied in the persons of two of their leaders, James Montgomery, who was apparently a genuine abolitionist zealot, and Charles Jennison, who was little different from an outlaw. Nearly from day one of the war, but especially after the St. Louis riot/massacre and the resulting increase in pro-Confederate sentiment within Missouri, Montgomery and Jennison were already crossing the border and burning and pillaging everything they could get their hands on. This is how Thomas Goodrich introduces Jennison in his book Black Flag. Quote, "That little fellow," said a man on the streets of Lawrence as he nudged a stranger nearby, "he don't look like a savage. Lord, let him get among the secessionists once." The man being singled out was Doc Jennison. True, Jennison did not look like a savage, nor did he seem a fit candidate to play a leading role in the coming border war. A physician from New York, a latecomer to the Kansas troubles, he was in stature short and slender. His habits were coarse and crude, and when the little redhead doffed his tall fur cap to the ladies, his greased hair stood on end like an enraged porcupine. Also, his intelligence was suspect. Jokes about his literacy, his smarts, were legendary, and one newspaper reported that the bandy-legged braggart had once offered a $100 reward for a lost $500 note. Whatever his failings, Charles Jennison was by 1861 the most popular man in Kansas, and although he indeed did not look like one, he was in fact a genuine savage. His tenure in Kansas had been relatively brief. Jennison had more than made up for lost time, however, and his reputation as a Jayhawker was second to none. He, more than any, had been instrumental in running pro-slavery settlers out of southern Kansas. Those individuals who failed to heed his warning to clear out normally did not live to heed a second. Soon after hostilities commenced in 1861, Jennison and his gang, known variously as the Mound City Sharps Rifles, the Southern Kansas Jayhawkers, and the 7th Kansas Cavalry, crossed the Missouri line and, with the U.S. flag flapping overhead, embarked upon a frenzy of looting, arson, and murder. Since many of the able-bodied men had left to join the forces under Sterling Price, Jennison had free play among the women, children, and old men that remained. Recalls one of his victims, Nanny Harris, quoting Harris now, "One night, while the family was asleep, the door of Mrs. McCorkle's room on the first floor was broken open, and a squad of noisy Jayhawkers rushed into the apartment. The alarmed lady entreated them to retire until she could put on her clothes, but they cursed her and told her to get up pretty damn quick or they would prod her with their sabers. A bright fire was burning in the open hearth. The wretches took blazing brands and carried them about as they ransacked the closets, dresser drawers, and trunks. A little girl who was sleeping with her mother was awakened by the unusual noise and began to cry, and one of the men went to her and, holding a saber against her face, told her if she uttered another sound he would cut her head off. The poor little thing was so frightened and subdued that she did not speak a word for days. The young girls who were asleep upstairs were aroused by the disturbance below, hastily dressed, and ran to their mother's room. The outlaws then turned their attention to the girls, using insulting terms, searched their persons for valuables, all the while singing ribald songs or telling obscene jokes. They took from a pocket in the housemaid's petticoat $40, tearing her apparel from her person. The creatures made the girls go before them as they searched every apartment in the house, from which they purloined every article of value they could carry. Then, returning downstairs, 3 of the wretches took by force 3 of the girls into the yard and marched back and forth in the moonlight, making most vicious threats and insinuations. After several hours of this atrocious conduct, the creatures started away." Back to Goodrich. Gray-headed planters, the respected pillars of their communities, were dragged from their palatial homes to cook, chop wood, and run menial errands wherever the Kansans camped. Younger men, caught unawares in Jennison's path, were not so lucky. Some were wrestled to the ground and held fast while the little Jayhawker drew his knife and personally sliced off their ears. Others fared even worse. In passing one woman's home, Jennison called her husband out and, according to the wife, now quoting the wife, "Without much parleying, he ordered his boys to string him up on his own piazza. In spite of my entreaties and crying, a rope was fastened to his neck, and with the other end thrown over a beam, he was jerked several feet into the air. As his neck was not broken, he struggled violently for release, when Jennison ordered 2 of his men to jump upon him and break his neck. This was done." End quote. Now, Jennison's unit wouldn't become known as the 7th Cavalry until a little later, which is an interesting transition in itself, which we'll get to. But at first, his men were, in essence, the same thing they were during the territorial period. A loose collection of violent men, both ideologues and opportunists, maybe loosely affiliated with the territorial militia, but their status in that respect was always unclear. That's a common theme we'll see with many groups on the border throughout the war, unclear status as to exactly what they are. The lines between official military units, partisan bands affiliated with the military of one side or the other, and straight-up outlaw gangs will become very blurred very fast. You pick out any band of armed men on the border and ask, are they a military unit or just an outlaw gang? And oftentimes it'll be pretty hard to tell. And in cases where it's not hard to tell, more often than not, the answer is that they're just outlaws. For Jennison, in the first month or so of the war, I'd chalk him up pretty easily as just an outlaw. And he wasn't alone. Montgomery was raiding very early as well, continuing his activities from before the war. He'd actually gone back east to Pennsylvania in 1859 with a band of men looking to rescue John Brown from prison after his capture at Harper's Ferry. Unlike Brown, that plan was never executed. But Montgomery did get a chance to meet with members of the Secret Six, namely Stearns, Higginson, and Sanborn, as well as a couple other Brown associates in New England radical abolitionist circles. Castell says Montgomery basically replaced Brown as the main military agent of that group and was operating with their support as he raided across the Missouri border in late 1860 and early 1861. Speaking of New England support, another little piece to this puzzle was that a historically severe drought hit Kansas starting in 1860, which led to an almost total failure of all crops in the territory that fall and showed drastic effects well into 1861. Right up through the modern day, this drought still ranks as one of the worst in Kansas history, behind only the Dust Bowl of the 1930s and maybe one or two others. And especially with the relative lack of development up to that point, this definitely wasn't helping Kansas settlers get established. As if plunder-hungry abolitionists needed any more reason to rob Missourians, throw into the mix the real necessity of securing supplies to live on. Kansas was not completely without support, though. It still had strong ties to the Northeast, and the New England Relief Committee was formed in 1860 to provide food and supplies to Kansas settlers suffering from the drought. Well, George Luther Stearns, of the Secret Six, just so happened to be friends with the Kansas representative for the New England Relief Committee, George W. Collamer. And after Montgomery met Stearns on his Pennsylvania trip, there is strong reason to believe, according to Castell, that through Stearns and Collamer, Montgomery and his men were getting Relief Committee supplies to support their jayhawking activity, supplies meant for Kansas settlers suffering from the drought. I gotta say, the more I learn about these guys, the harder it is to find anything redeeming about them. Anyway, Castell has this to say about these early raids. Quote, "The forays of Montgomery and Jennison caused intense anger and resentment in Missouri, and so much turmoil in southern Kansas that the responsible men of the region thought of leaving the state. Kansas and federal authorities made several attempts to suppress or restrain them, but had little or no success. Montgomery, Jennison, and their New England backers welcomed the outbreak of war as opening up new and broader fields of operations." End quote. In addition to Montgomery and Jennison, there was a third Jayhawker who took center stage in western Missouri as the war kicked off. His name will surprise no one, probably. It was Jim Lane. In Part 5, I said we'd get to another controversial episode in his career, and we didn't get to it then, but we'll get to it now. Lane came back to Kansas from his trip to Washington in June of 1861. And although he was a U.S. Senator now, his friend President Lincoln had personally mentioned to Secretary of War Simon Cameron that he thought Lane should be appointed a Brigadier General of Volunteers and given authority to raise a force to help the war effort in Missouri. The prospect of that fueled his rivalry with Charles Robinson, who, as governor of Kansas, had answered Lincoln's call for volunteers by raising 3 Kansas regiments, 2 of which would serve with Lyon at Wilson's Creek. Castell writes, quote, "The coming of war did not bring peace between Robinson and Lane. Instead, it only occasioned new conflict as the 2 men struggled to control the military affairs of the state. Legally, this control belonged to Robinson, who as governor commanded the state militia and who had been authorized by Washington to raise and organize Kansas regiments intended for federal service. But General Lane, as he was customarily called, was determined to be the war chieftain of Kansas. Military exploits had always provided the foundation of his political career, and by the summer of 1861, if not before, he was harboring presidential ambitions. Moreover, the patronage question was involved, for Robinson had the power to appoint and commission all the field and staff officers of the Kansas regiments, and could thereby build up a strong political machine and undercut Lane's position. Hence, if only to protect himself, Lane deemed it desirable to curtail Robinson's authority over military matters. By so doing, not only would he diminish his rival's political influence, but at the same time he would increase his own." End quote. Lane tried various things to undercut Robinson's political position within Kansas, and vice versa. He was helped considerably by the distinct advantage he had of being friends with Lincoln, but the one trump card Robinson had to play was the fact that Lane was a senator currently in office, and constitutionally couldn't be both a senator and a general at the same time, so he would have to give up one post or the other. That's in Article 1, Section 6, Clause 2, by the way, in case you want to look it up. Robinson decided to consider Lane to have vacated his Senate seat the moment he accepted the commission as Brigadier General, and in early July appointed his political ally Frederick Stanton to take over Lane's vacant seat. But Lane didn't want to give up his Senate seat. By the time Stanton showed up in Washington to replace him, Lane was back in Washington too, and defended his seat on the grounds that he had never officially accepted the military commission, which was true only on a silly paperwork filing technicality. But nevertheless, he won a hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee and kept his seat. The downside was that in keeping his Senate seat, he'd forfeited his commission as a Brigadier General of Volunteers. But if you think that was going to stop Lane from being a general anyway, you'd be mistaken. Castell writes, quote, "Armed with a brigadier's commission from Governor Oliver P. Morton of his native state of Indiana, Lane headed back to Kansas, determined, as he afterwards expressed it, to bet high on small cards. In the weeks to follow, he became the first and probably only man ever to command large numbers of United States troops without legal authority from the federal government. In spite of what had been in truth a rather sorry performance as leader of the Free State forces, Lane had a popular reputation of being a powerful fighter. Even those who despised him personally and opposed him politically had faith in him militarily. On August 15th, he made a speech at Leavenworth calling on Kansans to enlist in his brigade, and stating that when the Union Army marched into Missouri, he would not object to seeing an army of slaves marching out. This last remark presaged an important phase of his subsequent operations. As early as April 15th, the radical New Englander, N.W. Thayer, had written Montgomery expressing the hope that Lane could get into a position where he can reach the slaves, and Lane had proclaimed to Thayer's fellow abolitionist, George Luther Stearns, that given the opportunity, he would march to New Orleans by December, stirring up slave insurrections on the way. End quote. When Lane assembled his unit, which would become known as the Lane Brigade, it contained some newly recruited troops, but mainly was just an assembly of already existing Jayhawker bands, gathered together under Lane's banner and given legitimacy by some nominal connection to the Federal Army. This is what I was talking about earlier when I said the status of some of these units is often unclear. If you asked Lane, he'd tell you he was commanding official, bona fide federal volunteers. But Lane wasn't even a general in any legal sense and had no authority to raise federal troops, which in reality would make his brigade just a massive Jayhawker band. And it looked like a massive Jayhawker band, right down to the men in the ranks and the officers commanding them. James Montgomery was given a commission from Robinson and commanded a regiment, the 3rd Kansas Cavalry, and had his old Jayhawker buddy, Reverend John Stewart, under him as a company commander. Charles Jennison was given a commission by Frémont at the request of Robinson, and was also in the Lane Brigade, although he wouldn't come to command a full regiment, the 7th Kansas Cavalry, until November. Now, giving Jennison a commission, well, really Montgomery too, but especially Jennison, was absolutely inexcusable on Robinson's part. Robinson tried to justify it afterwards by saying Jennison just had violent tendencies by nature, and maybe if he could be made legitimate and disciplined by becoming an official part of the Federal Army, he'd stop robbing and murdering, which is absurd on its face. I mean, the idea that you're going to take a known murdering bandit and invest him with legal authority and then expect him to stop murdering and robbing now that he has even more power and an air of legitimacy from the federal government, that's ridiculous, and Robinson should have known better. I mean, Robinson was a savvy politician, okay? There's no way he didn't know exactly what kind of stuff Jennison was already doing on the border. In fact, his own excuse admits that he knew. I actually think Robinson did know better. He must have. He was too smart of a politician not to have known better. I'm just speculating here, but the real reason I think he would have recommended Jennison for a commission is the same kind of thing we talked about way back in a previous episode when the Lane-Robinson rivalry was getting started. I said then that I thought the peaceful, political type Robinson and the more militaristic Lane were really two sides of the same coin, and that their movement needed both kinds in order to function. Lane's type acting as the strong arm for the Robinson type and doing their dirty work for him, and the nonviolent resistance strategy of the Robinson type providing justification for the more violent side of the movement. Well, it's the same thing here. Robinson couldn't go jayhawking. He had his political career to think about, and that wasn't his brand. But he had to protect the borders of Kansas somehow, and he needed men like Jennison to do his dirty work for him, and he came up with a self-serving excuse after the fact to justify it. That's my take anyway. Whatever the case, Jennison got his commission, and the regiment that eventually formed under him was not much different in quality from Montgomery's. Castell writes, quote, Jennison did not have a complete regiment until November 7th. Many of his men were Missourians, and several units came from Illinois. The most notable company, however, came from Ashtabula County, Ohio, and was commanded by John Brown, Jr., the son of Osawatomie. Its members were all fanatical abolitionists. In the evening they would stand in a circle around their captain's tent and listen to the deep utterances of some impassioned orator. The speaker always closed with, "Do you swear to avenge the death of John Brown?" And the response would come, low and fierce, "We will, we will." Then they would sing the John Brown song, at first slowly and solemnly, then in accelerated time, ending with, "Then 3 cheers for John Brown, Jr." The entire regiment would gather to watch this strange but awesome ceremony. Another organization of more than passing interest, and in stark contrast to the Ashtabula County contingent, was Company H, which consisted mostly of criminals and ruffians. Its leader was Captain Marshall Cleveland, an ex-convict and a professional jayhawker. During the summer, he had committed a series of murders and robberies in Missouri border towns. He resigned his commission, however, on November 1st, following a quarrel with D.R. Anthony, who was the lieutenant colonel of the 7th Kansas, as Jennison's regiment was officially designated. Side note, D.R. Anthony is Dan Anthony, brother of the famous 19th century feminist and suffragette Susan B. Anthony. Also, just to be clear, Marshall is Marshall Cleveland's first name. He's not a U.S. Marshal or anything like that. Continuing. Some of the other officers of the regiment were hardly better than Cleveland, but none of them was a greater rogue than its colonel, or less competent. Jennison's conception of discipline was expressed by him as follows: "When we're in camp, we're all boys together, but when in the field, it's generally understood that I run the machine." And this was a specimen of one of his military orders. "Hello there, you, Mr. Man! Take a squad of men and go down to yonder house and burn it to the ground, as quick as the devil will let you." End quote. So these were the men Lane marched out of Fort Scott with once he eventually got them all assembled. Even before that could happen, though, as Price prepared to march north after Wilson's Creek, secessionist guerrillas were already retaliating. On September 3rd, a partisan band in the northern part of the state burned the railroad bridge over the Platte River, about 10 miles east of St. Joseph, in an effort to stop a train carrying federal troops into Missouri from Kansas. Sidney Clark was a passenger on that train, and he wrote, quote, "The train was running on time, leaving Easton at 10:30 o'clock, and was running at the rate of 25 miles per hour. After leaving Easton, I went into the back end of the middle car, and taking a seat some 3 or 4 seats from the door, laid down to sleep, with my head on my carpet bag. I had but just assumed this position when the terrific crash came. Quicker than thought, I found myself buried beneath a mass of ruins, bound hand and foot. My first sensation was that the car had run off the track and was being dragged at a furious rate across the ties. Half stunned and stupefied by the shock, I commenced to struggle for relief, all the time experiencing a sensation as if impelled along at a rapid rate. This was undoubtedly owing to the fact of my head being near the boiler of the engine, from which the steam was escaping with a loud roar. By this time I had relieved my hands and one of my feet, and by making violent struggles, succeeded in relieving the other foot, and began to crawl upward among the ruins. The night was very dark, and I was surrounded by the dead and dying, clasping me on all sides. I made my way through the top of the car, only to witness a terrible scene, which God forbid I should ever witness again. I saw that we had been precipitated from a stone abutment 30 feet high into the water, and among the charred ruins of a bridge. As one of my hands was useless, and not knowing how deep the water might be, I remained in this position some 5 minutes, during which the groans of the dying and screeches of the wounded for relief only were to be heard. I was enabled to escape from my position onto a sandbar in the middle of the river, and commenced to labor for the relief of the wounded. Out of about 100 persons contained in the 2 passenger cars, there were but 3 or 4 of us who were able to render assistance to the wounded. Dispatching a messenger to St. Joseph for relief, we continued to labor for 4 long hours. We built fires on the ends of the abutments as signals to approaching trains, and also a large fire on the right of the precipice, so that we might be enabled to work effectually in taking out the dead and wounded. At this point, a new horror was added to the scene. The cry went forth, "The train is on fire," from at least 20 voices, mostly confined to the lower part of the ruined mass. I rushed across the stream to the northern bank, and the first person I saw standing was Captain Carpenter, covered with blood from head to foot, and presenting a frightful appearance. I recognized him, and shouted to him, "For God's sake, put out that fire!" With a heroism I shall never forget, he rushed to the water's edge, and seizing the hat of a dead man by his side, commenced to throw water on the fire, and did it vigorously until it was extinguished. Soon after we heard the whistle of the train from St. Joseph, which it seems had been delayed for an hour or more, to repair a bridge 2 miles back which had but recently been lighted by the torches of the fiends. The train soon came up, bringing a large number of citizens and relief. Wet and exhausted, I crawled up the bank of the river, and resting a few moments by the fire, found my limbs so stiff that I was unable to render any further assistance, other than to point out to those just arrived the location of those still entangled in the wreck. 100 men were now at work. The dead were rapidly taken out, and daylight broke upon the scene, as if to intensify the horrors of the night. Both the dead and the wounded were taken upon the train, and in an hour more we were ready to move for St. Joseph, carrying with us 13 dead bodies and about 75 wounded, and doubtless leaving some of the dead still buried in the ruins at the place of the disaster. End quote. By mid-September, there were already secessionist partisans mounting retaliatory raids across the border into Kansas. One such raid, conducted by Captain John Matthews, struck the nearby town of Humboldt on September 8th, but it was mild in comparison to some of these raids. The rebels stole some property but didn't kill anyone or destroy any buildings. In fact, Goodrich says that in this early period of the war, quote, "The raids on the Kansas villages of Gardner, Aubrey, Chillicothe, and Humboldt were largely bloodless affairs, and, although traumatic to those affected, they accomplished little and had virtually no impact on the Jayhawkers, who continued with their program of dismantling West Missouri." It had at least one impact, though. Castell said in one of those quotes a little bit ago that Jennison had a fair number of Missourians in his regiment. Turns out these secessionist guerrillas weren't just raiding Kansas, they were also harassing Unionist Missourians on their own side of the border, and many of those fled across the border. Some of them ended up joining Jennison's regiment and other Jayhawker bands, so you actually had Missourians in Jayhawker bands sometimes. Also, this raid on Humboldt did impact Lane enough to cause him to send a force after the raiders. About a week later, that force, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Blunt, caught up with the guerrillas and killed Matthews in a gunfight. And in response to that, among other things, an even larger force came back to Humboldt in mid-October and burned most of the town to the ground. Lane, as well as plenty of other Kansans, feared that Price's Missouri Guards would invade Kansas following their victory at Wilson's Creek. Price wasn't very concerned with Kansas, though. He was looking to march north for the Missouri River to reclaim his own state. It's hard to know what Lane was actually thinking here. He was no military genius, and I think it's quite possible he really did think Price was about to march against him and the Kansas border. But on the other hand, even if he didn't think that, he probably would have played up that threat anyway for the sake of his own publicity, so who really knows? Robert Collins writes in his Lane biography, quote, "2 weeks after Wilson's Creek, Lane was informed by Colonel James Montgomery, from sources hitherto reliable, that 1,000 rebels were heading to Fort Scott. The informant also claimed that McCulloch was sending 4,000 picked men from Springfield and armed with Colts, Sharps, Maynard, and Minier rifles. However, 2 days later, Brigadier General Ulysses Grant, in command at Jefferson City, reported that McCulloch was moving on him. That same day, August 25th, Lane sent a dispatch to the commander of Fort Leavenworth that shows just how muddled the situation on the border was. He wrote that one Confederate force had been within 30 miles of Fort Scott, reported that he had information that 500 rebels were threatening Paola and Osawatomie, and hinted that Fort Leavenworth might be in danger. But he still wanted the artillery from there because a large force is marching upon us. 2 days after that, a letter was sent to Secretary of War Simon Cameron that told of rebel camps forming undisturbed through Missouri and relayed that their early concentration into another formidable army may reasonably be looked for. It is the opinion of some of our best-informed citizens, the author continued, obtained from their Southern correspondence that the possession of Missouri is regarded of the utmost importance to the Southern cause. He added that the possession of the lead mine of that state by the rebels will also be a most unfortunate thing for the country. That lead mine, which was shipping lead out through the town of Osceola, would be a key to future actions by Lane and his men. Meanwhile, on September 1st, Governor Robinson had sent his own opinion of the situation to Frémont. "I desire to say that we are in no danger of invasion," he wrote, "provided the government stores at Fort Scott are sent back to Leavenworth and the Lane Brigade is removed from the border." He emphasized, "But what we have to fear, and do fear, is that Lane's brigade will get up a war by going over the line, committing depredations, and then returning into our state." End quote. How right Robinson was about that. Jennison was already doing exactly what he feared, and as Lyon's shattered army retreated back towards St. Louis and Price's Confederates advanced, Lane made plans to move into Missouri. The first thing he did was establish the new town of Fort Lincoln to serve as his headquarters, north of Fort Scott on the Little Osage River, since he feared strong Confederate sympathies still existed in Fort Scott, and he might have been right about that. Fort Lincoln turned out to be a short-lived town, but apparently served Lane's purposes well enough while it existed. Here's Collins again, quote, "Not all the men under Lane at this time appreciated his attempt to create a new community. Charles Corey served in the 6th Kansas Cavalry, which was formed out of units of the Fort Scott Home Guards and other companies. In speaking to the Kansas State Historical Society in 1908, Corey alleged that Lane did give orders for the burning of Fort Scott. However, the men of the 6th and their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Jewell, refused to carry out the order. Instead, Jewell fortified the town and armed the citizens to defend against a Confederate attack. Whatever the facts regarding this matter, Lane continued to carry on his campaign. Writing an official report of the action on September 3rd, Lane claimed that his men drove back the advanced guard of the enemy, engaging the whole force of the enemy yesterday for 2 hours, 12 miles east of Fort Scott. Lane's command fell back to Fort Lincoln, but he allowed his cavalry forces to remain behind to amuse the enemy until we could establish ourselves here and remove our good stores from Fort Scott. He reported his losses as 5 killed and 6 wounded, adding that the enemy has suffered considerably. He also called for reinforcements, stating that he was surrounded by a superior force. "I am compelled to make a stand here," he said defiantly, "or give up Kansas to disgrace and destruction." In Lane's next message to his superiors, dated September 4th, he stated that he had 800 men at Fort Scott and 250 men in Barnesville, a dozen miles northeast of Fort Scott. Overall, he claimed to have a regular force of about 1,200 men and an irregular force of between 400 and 600 against a Confederate army in the neighborhood of 6,000 in fortified positions on Drywood Creek. Along with those numbers, he had 7 pieces of artillery, either 1 or 2 12-pounder howitzers, a 6-pounder, and 1,000 mounted men. Again, he asked for more men and artillery. On September 10th, Lane reported to the commander of Fort Leavenworth that he was moving east. He planned, he said, to march east as far as Papinsville, if possible, clearing out the valley of the Osage. From there he would turn north, clearing out the valley of the Merdazine, Butler, Harrisonville, Osceola, and Clinton. He related that, If attacked by an overwhelming superior force, I will, of cause, fall back on Kansas. Lane had under his command 1,200 infantry, 800 cavalry, and 2 pieces of artillery. He left 200 men at Fort Scott, 300 at Fort Lincoln, and 200 at Barnesville. End quote. That little action that Lane wrote a report about on September 3rd was known as the Battle of Drywood Creek. It was really more of a skirmish fought with some of the leading elements of Price's army, but Price considered it no more than a trifle and continued on to the north. Lane, meanwhile, waited until Price was well past him to the north and only then made his move to enter Missouri. Castell writes, quote, "On September 10th, with a smart little army of about 1,500, Lane started northward along the Missouri line. His avowed objective, however, was not to pursue Price, but to clear out the valley of the Osage and to pitch into the towns of Butler, Harrisonville, Osceola, and Clinton in Missouri. By the morning of September 12th, he reached Trading Post, Kansas, and from there turned eastward into Missouri. As soon as they crossed the border, his men began to plunder, burn, and perhaps murder and rape. Far from restraining them, Lane urged them on. 'Everything disloyal,' he cried, 'from a Durham cow to a Shanghai chicken, must be cleaned out.' Even the chaplains shared in the looting. One of them became so notorious for his pious zeal in acquiring the spoils of ungodly altars that on one occasion Lane halted his column, pointed in solemn mirth to a distant church spire, and exclaimed, 'See that steeple yonder? If we go there, the chaplain will try and steal it, and we will never get home in the world.' As they marched along, Lane's followers sang, to the tune of an old Methodist hymn, 'I am a soldier of the boss, a follower of Jim Lane, and shall I fear to steal a hoss, or blush to ride the same?' The answer to the last refrain was, of course, a resounding no." End quote. Now, at the risk of being a little too quotation-heavy, I'm going to read to you quite a bit from Thomas Goodrich's book, Black Flag. Just like his other book, War to the Knife, this one is chock full of first-hand accounts of events from this period, and I think it'll be worth it to read quite a few of these to give you a vivid picture of what was happening on the ground. As the Lane Brigade marched into Missouri, Goodrich quotes a correspondent from the Lawrence Republican, embedded with Montgomery's regiment, who wrote, quote, "Our eagles first pounced upon Papinsville, and the town went up in smoke and flame. As we passed through the country, the houses, barns, mills, and other property of rebels were brought to the altar, and full atonement made. Captain John E. Stewart paid his compliments to Butler, and the business part of that once thriving and pleasant village was burned to the ground. General Lane's expeditions in comparison with this were visitations of mercy." End quote. On September 17th, Montgomery's band raided Morristown, in an area of Cass County which had already been ravaged by genocide. By this time, the citizens knew very well what was coming and were banding together to defend themselves. That same correspondent writes, quote, "The plan of attack was this. Colonel Johnson, with 2 companies of cavalry and 1 mountain howitzer, was to start about 2 hours in advance, make a detour around the town, and take a position on the east to cut off retreat, while Colonel Montgomery, with the balance of the command, was to come up from the west and make the attack, which was to be the signal for Johnson to attack also. Colonel Johnson started about 2 hours in advance of the remainder of the force, made a circuitous march, but came into town on a road that brought his command in at the west end of the town, precisely where Montgomery was to commence the attack, and without waiting for the latter, charged into the camp of the enemy, taking them by surprise and putting them to a precipitous flight, leaving most of their horses, wagons, tents, camp equipage, etc. Soon the force within the buildings commenced to fire upon our men who were securing Secesh horses, etc. Colonel Johnson gave the order to fall back, but before it could be done, fell from his horse dead, his only exclamation being, 'Oh, my dear wife.' J.M. Copeland was killed instantly by a charge right through the head, making a hole 2 inches in diameter." Goodrich continues, "Angered by the death of his 2 men, when Montgomery finally arrived and scattered the defenders, he torched the town and then placed 3 captives before a drumhead court-martial." Jayhawker Joseph Trago continues in his diary, quoting Trago. While we were trying the prisoners, some scouts brought in 6 men who were coming to the camp ignorant of the fact that the rebels had been routed. 2 of the men were rebels and were bringing in 4 Union men as prisoners. Their prisoners were, of course, set at liberty, and the Missourians were taken out and shot with the others who, after trial, were sentenced to execution. They were all buried in one grave. End quote. That's what this war was about to be like in Missouri. Forget honor, forget rules of war, forget taking prisoners. In this world, prisoners are summarily executed. In this world, entire towns are burned to the ground and sometimes thousands of people left homeless in an afternoon. In this world, men cut off the ears of their enemies and wear them as necklaces. And look, like I said in the last episode, this stuff happens in war. It might be horrific, but it's not very surprising. But there's 2 things that make this war uniquely savage compared to other theaters of the Civil War. The first thing is how fast it escalated. There's nothing going on here that was unique to Missouri. Burning homes and towns, execution of prisoners, civilians by the thousands killed or left homeless. All of that would happen in other theaters, even back east where the war was fought much more like a traditional honorable war between organized field armies. But on the whole, in other theaters, the worst of that stuff would happen much later in the war. Late 1863 and into 1864 and 65. Well after the reality of what was going on had settled into the public consciousness and the Union was getting desperate to put an end to it. Out on the western border, this stuff was happening basically from day one. The escalation out here had already happened. That's what Bleeding Kansas was. What you had out here were a bunch of men, many of whom had come there in the first place, specifically because they'd caught a whiff of civil unrest in Kansas during the territorial period and could smell the prospect of some plunder. Now they'd been doing exactly this kind of stuff on a smaller scale for several years by 1861, and now they'd been handed an excuse to really pull out all the stops. The second thing that makes this war uniquely savage is that out here in western Missouri, this kind of violence wasn't the exception, it was the norm. Okay, the reason things like the Potawatomi Massacre or the Merdazine Massacre are so infamous is that they're exceptional. In a sane world, people are rightfully appalled by things like that. But as this descent into madness continues, this world will become insane very quickly and stay that way for years. And things like those massacres will become just another Tuesday. Part of the horror of all this is how normal this stuff becomes. The Outlaw Josie Wales, one of my favorite movies. You've heard clips from it in the intro to this show. It's about this exact time period. In that movie, the reason Josie Wales becomes a Confederate guerrilla and eventually an outlaw after the war is that Jayhawkers show up, kill his wife and son, and burn his house to the ground. Specifically Redlegs. Don't worry, we'll talk about them in good time. And yes, it's a movie, but that's not fiction, okay? That stuff was happening routinely, from day one, right up through the end of the war, and even beyond in some cases. I want to drive home this point because keep in mind as we go forward, the specific incidents I'm going to tell you about over the next few episodes, for the most part, those are just the ones that we have firsthand accounts of. Somebody wrote a letter about it, or somebody kept a journal that survived for historians to read. But how many countless other incidents must there have been where nobody wrote a letter describing it, nobody wrote about it in their journal, or maybe nobody even survived to tell the story at all? So this is the kind of madness we're dealing with on the Kansas-Missouri border, and it was only about to get worse. Now, before I go further, I just have to point something out about Collins's book, and now seems as good a time as any to do it. Collins really likes Jim Lane. while he does give you quotes and statements from various historians over the years who've written about Lane and Robinson, both favorably and unfavorably, at the end of the day, he sees Lane as a good guy, and he wants his readers to see him as a good guy too. And to that end, he takes every chance he can get to downplay or ignore the worst actions of Lane and anyone associated with him or acting under his orders. And that Morristown raid I just talked about a minute ago is a prime example, along with another even more prime example that I'm about to get to. First off, Collins doesn't even mention that James Montgomery was there at Morristown, but his dates line up with the dates given by Goodrich, so I'm certain they're talking about the same raid. And Goodrich describes it as being led by Montgomery. And secondly, if you remember from a few minutes ago, first-hand accounts from within Montgomery's own force describe the summary executions of at least 5 prisoners taken in the fight at Morristown. How does Collins describe this raid? Quote, on September 16th, Lane sent some 600 men and 2 howitzers against a rebel camp at Morristown, Missouri, in Cass County. They succeeded in routing the enemy, he wrote, killing 7, capturing their entire camp equipage, tents, wagons, etc., some 100 horses and horse equipments. Union losses were 2 killed and 6 wounded, with 4 of them having mere flesh wounds. However, one of the dead was an officer in his brigade, Colonel H.P. Johnson. End quote. And that's all he says about it. No mention of the executions of any prisoners. I don't want to harp on this too much because this isn't a review of Collins' book, after all, and maybe it's not that egregious of him to leave out details like that in 1 or 2 cases, but what I'm saying is that it's these kinds of little things that add up to the point where I don't really trust his characterization of Lane. And that's far from the most egregious example in the book. Much worse, in my opinion, is his actual defense of Lane's actions about a week later at another Missouri town, Osceola. I'll just read you Collins' account of that raid first. Quote, following this successful attack was one of the most controversial military actions Lane and his men undertook. On September 22, 1861, Lane's brigade moved on Osceola, Missouri, burning and looting the town and leaving some men dead. Reports vary as to what actually took place. Lane's first report of the action, dated September 24th, stated that Confederates had ambushed the approaches to the town, and, after being driven from them by the advance under Colonels Montgomery and Weir, they took refuge in the buildings to annoy us. We were compelled to shell them out, and in so doing the place was burned to ashes, and 15 or 20 of them killed and wounded. Although having strong Union sympathies, Leverett Spring wrote what became an accepted account of events when he said that Lane sacked and burned the town, and a score of inhabitants were killed. Spring even charged Lane's chaplain of stealing Confederate altars in the interest of his unfinished church at home. John Spear went to Osceola around the turn of the century to discover what people there said had happened. One man told Spear that Lane boxed up the records in the county courthouse before setting the town on fire. Another speculated that because the town had a large quantity of supplies on hand, Lane fired it to prevent them from falling into the hands of Price's army. Everyone whom Spear talked to agreed on several facts. The first was that whoever was killed died in the skirmish before Lane's men entered town. The town was prosperous due to the steamboat trade and could have been used as a base of supply for Confederate forces, thus providing some justification for Lane's raid. There was a great quantity of whiskey in town, but Lane had it burned rather than given to his men. Lane's men did not commit any outrages against the women of Osceola, and they did not plunder the town, rob the bank, or perform atrocities against the citizens. End quote. So Lane burned Osceola, but he was probably justified militarily in doing it, so it's fine. He saved the courthouse records, you see. He didn't let his men get drunk on the whiskey. There weren't any rapes. They didn't rob the bank. I need to stop before this turns into a review of Collins, but the point is, this is an absurdly sanitized version of what happened at Osceola. Now I'll read you Goodrich's version, and unlike Collins, Goodrich gives us copious first-hand accounts from people who were there. He writes, quote, "Following the Southern victory at Wilson's Creek on August 10, 1861, and after Sterling Price's triumphant rebel army had safely passed north on its way to invest and capture the river port of Lexington, Lane and his Jayhawkers slipped into Missouri. The command, which numbered roughly 1,500 men, and which Lane proudly dubbed the Kansas Brigade, was little more than a mob of thieves and adventurers. Soon after crossing the border, the Kansans went on a looting and burning rampage. Late in September, Lane reached the outskirts of Osceola, the metropolis of southwest Missouri. In the words of Mrs. M.E. Lewis, quoting Mrs. Lewis now, "We learned that an army from Kansas was approaching, and at about 12 o'clock at night a neighbor waked us up to tell us they could be heard coming. I called our daughter, and we prepared to watch them from the window. It was a clear moonlight night. We could see them plainly and hear them talking. They passed our house on horseback, their guns glistening in the moonlight. When their front had passed us some 300 yards, and the roadway filled with horsemen as far back as we could see, suddenly a company under Captain J. M. Weidemeyer fired upon them from the brush. They wheeled and galloped back up the road without firing a shot. Then a piece of artillery was run down and fired upon Weidemeyer's men. They returned the fire and drove the artillerymen away. Soon their mounted men came down the road again and were driven back. Weidemeyer, hearing them forming, dismounted, took a few men and crawled close to them and again fired on them. We heard a tremendous volley of musketry, and soon all opposition was gone." Then Goodrich says, "A correspondent with the Kansas Brigade continues," quoting that correspondent now, "This was the last we saw of the enemy. Our men slept upon their arms that night. The first object that greeted their eyes as they came in sight of town next morning was a large secession flag floating over the courthouse. It was supposed the enemy was fortified there. Captain Thomas Moonlight was ordered to send over some of his feelers, i.e. artillery rounds, and ascertain the facts. The enemy was not there. We then carefully and slowly felt our way into town. Every place of ambush was thoroughly searched, but the rebels had fled. The town had scarcely an inhabitant, except women and children. It had been reported that Osceola was thoroughly infested with the leprosy of treason, that it had been a place of rendezvous for the rebels, and a place of deposit for their ammunition and provisions. A little search discovered a large amount of lead, many tons, cartridge paper, some powder, and a place where cartridges had been made, clothing and provisions for the rebel army. The question then came up in reference to the disposition that should be made of the rebel town. The subject was earnestly discussed by the officers. Colonel William Weir favored sparing the town. The others decided to burn it. Here we come to the horrors of war. They surpass all description. There are men whose souls are feasted and glutted with delight at the sight of distracted women, weeping children, and burning cities." Back to Goodrich. "While hundreds of shouting Jayhawkers ran through the streets, looting homes, shops, and barns, officers, in an effort to prevent the men from getting drunk, tried to destroy large stocks of liquor in the town. Although 150 barrelheads were quickly staved in, many Kansans nevertheless succeeded in filling their canteens and themselves. Adds William Johnson, son of a U.S. senator whose own stately home was destroyed," now quoting Johnson, "The Yankees then loaded all the wagons they could find in Osceola and the vicinity with goods from the stores and records from the courthouse, and then burned the courthouse and the business houses and most of the residences, and would have burned them all but for the fact that some of their scouts reported the approach of Confederate troops, a report which was not true. They then made a hasty exit." Back to Goodrich. "As the sun went down Sunday night," concluded the brigade correspondent, "Osceola was a heap of smoldering ruins. 3,000 people were left homeless when Osceola was burned, and perhaps the fairest city in Missouri had been utterly wiped from the face of the earth. You must march so that the traitors will feel the difference between loyalty and disloyalty," shouted Lane as his brigade set off on a circuitous sweep of the border. Good to his word, Lane followed through. Noted a reporter for the New York Daily Times, now quoting that reporter, "I found all through western Missouri a deadly horror entertained towards Lane. Everywhere that he has been, he carried the knife and torch with him, and has left a track marked with charred ruins and blood. An old man told me his story, told with composure, when he said that they had taken his horses, mules, grain, his wife's dresses, and then fired the log shanty that afforded his gray hairs shelter from the pelting rain and nipping frosts. He told all this in detail with a firm voice, but when he added, "They even stole the clothes of my little dead grandson," his lip trembled convulsively a moment, and then the hot tears gushed from his eyes. End quote. Now, I want to remind you that this is September on the frontier. Winter is right around the corner. Homelessness in winter on the frontier could easily be a death sentence in the 19th century. It could still be a death sentence today in a lot of cases. It's easy for us to forget that while we sleep comfortably in our climate-controlled houses in the 21st century. Who knows how many of those 3,000 people turned out of the burning ruins of Osceola didn't make it through the winter? Where exactly were that many people supposed to go? Osceola was by far the largest town in that region of Missouri. Jefferson City was more than 50 miles away, and Springfield was even farther. There weren't any railroads in that region, and the Jayhawkers had taken all the horses they could. How were a bunch of women and children, with nothing left but the clothes on their backs for the most part, supposed to make it anywhere they could reasonably expect to safely shelter for the winter? Goodrich quotes a soldier named Henry Palmer, who writes of something he saw as his unit was camped near the border. Quote, "I was on duty as sergeant of the guard on a picket nearly a mile from the main camp. It had been raining all night, a cold, drizzly rain. At 10 a.m., we saw a woman approaching from down the dreary, uninhabited roadway. She was on foot and was carrying a baby hugged to her breast, with 4 little children also walking, 2 boys and 2 girls, the oldest a girl of 7 years. All were in their night clothes, and all wet to the skin, children crying and suffering with cold and hunger. The babe was dead. The mother died from this exposure within 36 hours. The 4 children were sent to 4 different homes." End quote. And here's Albert Castell's assessment of the sack of Osceola. He published the first edition of his book in 1958, and it's almost like he was predicting the kinds of things that a guy like Collins would say when he published his book in 2007. He writes, quote, "Lane and his friends justified the sacking of Osceola on the grounds of military necessity and merited retaliation for a recent Confederate raid on Humboldt, Kansas. A newspaper correspondent who accompanied the Lane Brigade on its march related that Colonel Weir did not want to burn the town, but was overruled by the other officers for the following reasons. Osceola was traitorous to the cause, that the enemy intended to make the town during the winter a military post, that it was a strong position and could be easily fortified, and that since it could not be permanently occupied, it should be rendered uninhabitable. All these reasons are specious and beside the point, for they could have applied just as well to nearly every town in that section of Missouri. Equally absurd is the story, also put out by Lane's apologists, that all the houses of Osceola were stocked with gunpowder intended for Price's army, and that destruction of the town prevented the Missouri commander from using it as a winter base. Price had no such quantities of powder to leave in a defenseless town, and during the winter of 1861 to 1862, his army experienced little difficulty in remaining along the Osage River in the vicinity of Osceola. Lane's own report contradicts all the above explanations, as he stated that the enemy took refuge in the buildings of the town, and that he was compelled to shell them out, and the place was burned to ashes. The truth of the matter is that Lane's brigade was an irresponsible mob which looted and burned Osceola out of a wanton lust for plunder and a self-righteous desire to injure the Missourians. The sack of Osceola was henceforth to be a prime cause of bitter hatred of Lane and all things Kansan on the part of the people of western Missouri." End quote. Now, although I won't go to absurd lengths to defend Lane like Collins does, I also won't just outright condemn him personally, because as horrific as all this stuff is, it's never just one man who's responsible for it. Yes, Lane gave the order to burn Osceola, or at least concurred with all his top officers except Weir, but there had to be a certain set of circumstances in place before he would have even been able to reasonably contemplate something like that. And it's not just the existence of a state of war that makes an action like that possible to consider. I mean, there was a state of war in Virginia too, and nothing like this was happening out there, at least not yet. There was a series of Dan Carlin's hardcore history a long time ago called Logical Insanity. It was about the development of military aviation and strategic bombing throughout the world wars. It starts with one of the questions everybody likes to ask about World War II, which is, was it right or wrong to drop the atomic bombs on Japan? And then Carlin backs up and says, wait. Isn't this a totally insane question to be asking in the first place? Because whether or not you think that was the right decision under the circumstances, it's undeniably horrific to incinerate an entire city in the blink of an eye. And then he backs up and traces the history of how we got to that point where anyone was even considering something like that as a possibility. And this is why I didn't just jump straight into recounting horrific things that happened in Missouri in 1861, because the fact that a guy like Jim Lane is even considering the possibility of burning a city to the ground is an indication that we're already in insanity world. Even though Jim Lane gave the order, there's no one man solely responsible for something like this. Collins, in his Lane biography, falls into the trap of this fake dialectic where Lane has to be either a good guy or a bad guy, and he's already decided Lane was a good guy, so he'll find any way he can to defend or excuse his worst actions and play up the importance of his best ones. But in reality, Lane gave an order that made 3,000 civilians, mostly women and children, homeless in winter, which undoubtedly condemned many of them to death. That's horrific any way you slice it. And frankly, this is just my opinion, but I find it kind of gross to try to just play that off like it ain't no thing. If you hear about something like that and the first thing you jump to is, well, here's why it wasn't that bad, actually, or here's why it was justified, you've already lost the plot, in my humble opinion. But at the same time, like I said before, you have to look at what led up to this and how we arrived at a point where it was even possible. And once you know the story of Bleeding Kansas and everything that led up to this, I think what you'll end up asking is, what did you expect? Of course this kind of stuff was going to happen. I don't think anything is inevitable per se, but like I said in Part 5 when I referred to that quote on the Soviet Afghanistan invasion, this stuff isn't that hard to predict when you go to war. If there's a sense in which anything is inevitable, it's something like, horrific things are guaranteed to happen when you go to war, above and beyond mere battles. And in my mind, the guys like Lane who give the immediate orders on the ground for stuff like this are responsible in a kind of secondary way to whoever made the deeper decisions that got us here in the first place. And by the way, I'd say the same thing for just about any horrific event you could name from the Civil War. The burning of Jackson, Mississippi, the Fort Pillow Massacre, Sherman's March to the Sea, the central event of the war in Kansas that I won't name right now because we'll get to it in a later episode. Take your pick. I mean, if you find yourself in a situation where it's possible to reasonably come to the conclusion that nuking a city, or in this case, burning one to the ground, is the best option available, I think it's safe to say you've already crossed into some kind of upside-down world. There's a perfect storm of factors that make the burning of Osceola a reasonable possibility in the mind of Jim Lane. There's half a decade of the pent-up rage and hatred that was bred during the Bleeding Kansas era, and that's why understanding Bleeding Kansas is so essential to understanding the war in Missouri. In his book, A Disease in the Public Mind, Thomas Fleming sums up the diseases existing in the northern and southern public minds as fear of slave revolt and race war in the South, and abolitionist-driven hatred of Southerners in the North, and that Northern disease contributes to this too. Besides the overblown image of Missourians fed to them by abolitionist newspapers and politicians, as we've been over, there were also plenty of real things that real Missourians did during the territorial period that Kansans felt they needed to take revenge for. And besides all that, there's the very real military concern of secessionist partisans in the region. Partisans like the ones that raided Humboldt, for the most part, weren't supported by any Confederate military organization. They were operating in their own backyard. They knew every game trail and creek and ravine in their neighborhood far better than any Union officer did, and any material support they got would have been coming from the local populace. This is the classic problem of every counterinsurgency operation. How do you deprive the insurgents of their support? Well, burning the homes of all their supporters to the ground might be one way, but that can easily backfire, and some in the Federal Army were already having premonitions of how it was going to backfire. Major General Henry Halleck, who replaced Frémont as the department commander in November, would say, quote, "They are no better than a band of robbers. They cross the line, rob, steal, plunder, and burn whatever they can lay their hands upon. They disgrace the name and uniform of American soldiers. The course pursued by those under Lane and Jennison has turned against us many thousands who were formerly Union men. A few more such raids will make Missouri as unanimous against us as is Eastern Virginia." End quote. Lane wasn't even supposed to have been anywhere near Osceola on the day of the sack. By mid-September, Price had besieged the town of Lexington on the Missouri River, and Frémont ordered Lane's brigade to come north to Fort Leavenworth and cooperate with other Union forces in the area to relieve Lexington. Frémont sent that order on September 18th, and the sack didn't happen until the 23rd, and Lane didn't respond to the order until the 24th. Who knows if he received the order before or after the sack, but he did head north for Fort Leavenworth. By that time, though, the siege was already resolved, and the brief career of the Lane Brigade was mostly over. The career of Jennison's 7th Kansas Cavalry was just getting started, though. On pretext of protecting Union supply trains in Jackson County, they crossed the border in mid-November and pushed for independence. A woman named Margaret Hayes of Westport, near Kansas City, wrote to her mother, quote, "We have been overrun with Jayhawkers, and they have robbed and harassed us, and our neighbors have suffered a great deal from them. Uncle Jimmy has lost upwards of $10,000 worth. They came to his house one night and took 8 Negroes, a fine carriage, a 2-horse wagon, some horses and mules, and robbed his house of all bed clothing and everything valuable. In a few days they came to the same house, took about 70 head of sheep, and 45 or 50 head of the finest stock there was in the county. And a few days after they went to another neighbor some 2 miles off, took the Negroes, went to the beds and rolled them up, saying they would take them to their wives. The same day they took some 30 head of stock from Uncle Lem's. The next day, 20 Jayhawkers came to our nearest neighbors with 10 wagons and said they came to take everything the old man had. Some went into the house packing up, some in the orchard, some fixing to load up wheat. Some had all the stock drawn up. In the evening, 53 of them came to our house and surrounded it. I met them on the portico and invited them in. They said they came to take everything we had and burn us out. I asked the leaders into my room. I talked nicely to them, and after a time they told me they would not rob my house, but would take everything else they could find outdoors. The men that were left to guard the house taunted me every way they could to get me to say something. I never noticed them, only when they would ask some questions, and would answer them as kindly and in the mildest way I could. They took 2 wagons loaded full from here, my carriage, and every Negro on the place. 11 I had. It was very aggravating to see it driven up to the door, and to see Negroes jump into it and drive off. I am looking every hour for everything I have to be taken, and my house destroyed by these Jayhawkers." Goodrich continues, "A short time later, with the addition of a company of armed Negroes led by a black officer, Jennison set his regiment in motion toward Independence, 10 miles east of Kansas City. Fletcher Pomeroy, a Kansan riding in the column farther back, jotted down in his diary, quoting Pomeroy, Company H was advance guard, marching about 1/4 of a mile in advance of the main column. As we marched along, we suddenly discovered a building on fire a short distance in advance. As we approached, we saw that it was a grist mill. We wondered how it got afire, but we soon learned. We had gone but a little further when a turn in the road brought us in sight of a house. Women and children were fleeing to the woods, while members of our advance guard were smashing in the windows and firing the house. Across the street were several stacks of wheat and oats. These were also fired. Back to Goodrich. After torching the remaining homes along the road, Jennison finally reached Independence. A regimental correspondent continues, quoting that correspondent, Upon our approach, no enemy was to be seen. The streets were almost forsaken. The command was divided into 3 divisions and entered the town at a good speed. Men were stationed at the 4 corners of the public square to guard the streets, while the other squads were engaged in bringing men, horses, wagons, and carriages, which were easily found. The citizens were put inside of the public square, there to await an examination. After the men were collected, and the companies had fallen in ranks and formed about the square, the examination began. The secessionists were separated from the Union men, and to the latter were given property which had been collected. The sifting process was continued until the crowd inside the square was narrowed down to a very small number. Colonel Jennison then read his proclamation to the small assembly of traitors, after which he made them a very handsome speech. He told them that he had the names of all the men of secession tendencies, and that he knew them. Their names were all written down, and there was no use for them to talk like Union one day and act secession the next. He told them that he had been sent among them to protect the government property, and that if one of the Union men of Independence was molested, the secessionists shall pay 10 times for the injury done him, and that if they permitted secession leaders to bring their men into town without raising objection and doing their best to prevent it, Independence would be leveled to the ground. Back to Goodrich. Jennison thereupon lent force to his words by ransacking the stores and shops of the town and burning a home. The command returned to camp, concluded the correspondent, all satisfied that a good day's work had been done. A short time later, Jennison struck south. In the words of renowned artist and Missouri Unionist George C. Bingham, now quoting Bingham, his entire route from Independence to West Point may be traced by the ruins of the dwellings of our citizens, which were first pillaged and then burned without discrimination or mercy. As they were generally constructed of wood, they are now but heaps of ashes, above which the tall chimneys remain in their mute solitude. End quote. Castell says that Dan Anthony and not Jennison was actually in command of the 7th during most of this raid, since Jennison was busying himself auctioning off loot from previous raids. And there was plenty of loot from this raid, too. Here's Goodrich again. Quote, By the end of January 1862, much of the wealth of western Missouri had been stripped. Sometimes in single carts, but often in wagon trains several miles long, the plunder-filled caravans crossed the line into Kansas to be distributed among the people or auctioned off to the highest bidder in Lawrence, Leavenworth, Wyandotte, or Fort Scott. Had the wagons rolling west hauled only the loot of secessionists, the federal government would have said little. In their zeal to punish and despoil Missouri, however, the Jayhawkers, dressed in blue and flying the stars and stripes, had made little effort to winnow the loyal from the disloyal. What happened to Lizzie Brannick's family at Chapel Hill was repeated over and over again throughout western Missouri. Quoting Lizzie Brannick now, Jennison and his gang came upon us, stripped us of nearly everything, and would have burned us out but for proving that we were Union and had never done anything against the government. They burned 150 houses. Helpless women and young children sick were taken out and left standing in the snow, while all they owned on earth save the land was destroyed before their eyes. Later they came upon us while going a few miles from home, and put me and my 2 children off in the mud a good distance from any house. Back to Goodrich. As a result of raids such as this, many Missouri Unionists, Lizzie Brannick's revenge-minded husband included, ran off and eagerly joined the rebel forces. Too late, high-ranking federal officers realized the havoc the Jayhawkers had wrought. End quote. And to add to all these problems, just like during the Bleeding Kansas period, here you also have opportunists. Small independent bands, totally unsanctioned by the federal government, who took the opportunity to loot and plunder, just like the Lane Brigade and the 7th Cavalry. The now 15-year-old Buffalo Bill Cody took up with one of these bands. He wrote, quote, "A man by the name of Chandler proposed that we organize an independent company for the purpose of invading Missouri and making war on its people on our own responsibility. He at once went about it in a very quiet way, and succeeded in inducing 25 men to join him. His plan was that we should leave our homes in parties of not more than 2 or 3 together, and meet at a certain point near Westport on a fixed day. His instructions were carried out to the letter, and we met at the rendezvous at the appointed time. Chandler had been there some days before us, and thoroughly disguised had been looking about the country for the whereabouts of all the best horses. He directed us to secretly visit certain farms and collect all the horses possible and bring them together the next night. This we did, and upon reassembling it was found that nearly every man had 2 horses. We immediately struck out, and as soon as we had set foot upon Kansas soil we separated, with the understanding that we were to meet 1 week from that day at Leavenworth. Some of the parties boldly took their confiscated horses into Leavenworth, while others rode them to their homes. This action may look like horse stealing, and some people might not hesitate to call it by that name, but Chandler plausibly maintained that we were only getting back our own, or the equivalent, from the Missourians, so we didn't let our consciences trouble us very much. We continued to make similar raids on the Missourians off and on during the summer." Goodrich continues, "Many who joined jayhawking bands were nothing more than common criminals. Marshal Cleveland and his gang of thinly veiled patriots brazenly worked both sides of the border, robbing and murdering Unionist and rebel alike. A former follower of Jennison, Cleveland soon broadened his range to include bank robbery and counterfeiting, as well as the wholesale plundering of emigrant wagon trains. Even in the tumultuous climate of the border, such flagrant outlawry could not go unchecked for long, and a correspondent for the Lawrence State Journal described what happened when federal troops finally closed in on Cleveland." Quoting that correspondent now, "He had recently come down from the northern part of the state, bringing a woman with him, who he passed off for his wife. They stopped in Osawatomie and were accompanied by a number of tools, who executed promptly the orders of their leader. It is said that some 25 or 30 desperadoes, clothed in the garb of U.S. soldiers, were in the neighborhood at the time. Captain Harris S. Greeno sent out a couple of scouts to watch the movements of Cleveland, and being satisfied that they had him in their grasp, a detachment of 10 soldiers were sent forward, under the command of Lieutenant Anson Walker, to bag the game and bring it into camp. Surrounding the town during the night, they closed in upon it the next morning, and found Cleveland at the hotel. He stated emphatically to Lieutenant Walker that he would not be taken alive. After much parleying, he passed to his woman $300 in change, which he had in his pocket, and said if allowed to go to the house of Mr. Chestnut, he would give himself up. He was allowed to start, but it seems that some previous arrangements had been made with a portion of his band, for soon after appearing in the street, a saddled horse was furnished him, on which he sprang and rode for the valley of the Pottawatomie. Lieutenant Walker's detachment joined in pursuit, firing occasional shots at him, all to no purpose. Reaching the bed of the stream, it seems he dismounted from his horse, when he partially hid himself under a steep bank, and, with cocked revolver, awaited the arrival of his pursuers. As Private John T. Johnson was riding along the bank, he discovered Cleveland under the same, and partly concealed by the roots of a tree. Each drew his revolver, but Johnson, it seems, was the coolest, for he aimed and fired, almost perpendicularly downwards, towards Cleveland, the ball entering the right shoulder near the neck, passing through the heart, and out just above the left hip. Cleveland seemed conscious for a few moments, for others coming up and leveling their pieces at him, he said, "Oh, don't, boys," and, gasping, died. End quote. Another independent Jayhawker named Peter Bryant summed up in a letter to his brother the benefits of freelancing as opposed to joining the Federals. Quote, I received from Governor Charles Robinson a commission as First Lieutenant of Kansas Militia. In July, our captain raised a company and went into the Army, and I mustered about 50 men and went into Missouri. All the difference between us was he jayhawked under cover of Uncle Sam, and I under a lieutenancy from Governor R. I marched when I damned pleased, he when he was told to. I kept my plunder, if I chose. He didn't. I took my pay as I went along, he when he could get it. I have disbanded my squad. He has got to stick her till war is over. End quote. None of this was going to do anything like pacifying Missouri. It was going to do the opposite, obviously. We've already seen a couple of retaliatory raids, and those were only going to get worse as time went on. Castell sums it up like this in his book, quote, Kansans generally approved the forays of Lane and Montgomery, of Jenison and Anthony, through the border counties of Missouri. Their growing anti-slavery fervor caused them to applaud the slave-liberating aspect of these operations, especially since the freed Negroes relieved the labor shortage in Kansas. Moreover, reports, true, exaggerated, and false, of outrages suffered by Kansans and other Union adherents along the border at the hands of Missouri secessionists seemed to warrant retaliation in kind. In addition, the people of Kansas had a distorted concept of the object and nature of the activities of Lane and Jenison. They believed that their campaigns were designed to put down treason and guard against invasion, and the newspaper correspondents who accompanied Lane's brigade in the 7th Kansas wrote up the supposedly heroic exploits of these commands and either ignored or glossed over the looting and killing. Finally, there was a rather sizable element in Kansas who, out of economic and moral poverty, were quite willing to advocate and practice the plundering of the farmers of western Missouri, who had a dangerous reputation for wealth. The majority of Kansans tended to classify all Missourians, at least those living in the border counties, as rebels. This viewpoint ran counter to the facts and largely reflected prejudice, ignorance, and a desire to rationalize the depredations in Missouri. Probably from 1/3 to over 1/2 of the people residing in western Missouri were in 1861 loyal to the Union, or at least neutral. One of the main results of the raids of Lane and Jenison was to turn many of these Unionists and Neutralists into Confederates. By the end of 1861, Major General Henry W. Halleck, then in command of the Department of the West, was of the opinion that a few more such raids would make Missouri as Confederate as Eastern Virginia. In January, Halleck, angered by almost daily complaints of outrages committed by Jenison, threatened to drive the Jayhawkers out of Missouri if they did not return to Kansas immediately, and to disarm and hold them prisoners should they resist. On the Confederate side, Ben McCulloch informed his government that Lane's brigade greatly injured the Union cause in Missouri by taking Negroes belonging to Union men. In view of Lincoln's desire to conciliate Missouri and the other border states, it is hard to understand why he was so tolerant of Lane and Jenison's jayhawking operations, and merely commented on a letter of Halleck's criticizing Lane, "I am sorry General Halleck is so unfavorably impressed with General Lane." Another serious consequence of the Lane-Jenison incursions was that they transformed the already existent animosity of the people of western Missouri toward Kansas into an embittered and impassioned hatred. This feeling was not confined to pro-Confederate Missourians, but also affected pro-Unionists. Thus, George C. Bingham, the famous Missouri artist, resented the pillaging of Kansas troops so intensely that while serving as a Union officer, he refused to cooperate with them in operations against Price. And on at least one occasion, Missouri State Militia and Federal Service warned that they would fire on Kansas soldiers if they did not stay on their side of the line. By the spring of 1862, the general situation along the border was so tense that Brigadier General John M. Schofield, commander of the Department of Missouri, wrote Secretary of War Stanton that it was absolutely necessary to keep Kansas units out of Missouri and Missouri units out of Kansas. Unless this were done, it would be difficult to prevent open hostility between the Union troops of Kansas and Missouri. Schofield further recommended that both states be included in the same military district in order that the movements of their respective troops could be coordinated so as to keep them apart. The chief obstacle to the speedy pacification of Missouri, added Schofield, lay in the lawless bands of bordermen who exploited the bitter feeling existing between the border people, which feeling is the result of old feuds and involves very little, if at all, the question of union or disunion. Scores, perhaps hundreds, of Missourians in the country devastated by Lane, Jennison, and Anthony formed guerrilla bands or joined the Confederate Army. The force under Upton Hayes which Anthony encountered on the Little Blue in November had been raised in the locality to defend it against Jennison. Hayes was a freighter engaged in the Santa Fe trade when the war began, operating out of the town of Little Santa Fe near Kansas City. He turned guerrilla after the Jayhawkers captured one of his wagon trains, burned his house, and took his cattle, horses, carriages, and slaves. Far from stamping out such bands as Hayes's, the marches of Lane and Jennison served only to increase their number, strength, and determination. End quote. We've already been over a couple of early Confederate retaliations like Humboldt, and then skipping on down the page a little bit, Castell says, quote, "In this manner, a maelstrom of retaliation and counter-retaliation built up, and the consequences should not have been hard to foresee." End quote. As the Jayhawkers under Lane, Montgomery, Jennison, and others ravaged western Missouri, the situation looked dire for the Union elsewhere in the state. Lyon's army was shattered after Wilson's Creek, with the survivors on their way back to St. Louis to recover and regroup, and at the moment Frémont had no other significant forces in the area to oppose Price. Price, for his part, started advancing north, mostly unopposed, being joined all along his route of march by new recruits eager to throw off the federal yoke. And it was only Price that advanced, not McCulloch, who had fought with him at Wilson's Creek. The reason for that goes back to the chaotic state of things in Missouri and the shifting allegiances of this early period of the war. Remember, Price commanded a Missouri militia force and had an eye towards securing Missouri for the secessionists, while McCulloch was a Confederate regular with the primary responsibility of defending Arkansas in the Indian Territory. Albert Castell explains it like this in his book General Sterling Price and the Civil War in the West. Quote, "The battered remnants of Lyon's army retreated to Rolla, where it had a direct rail link with St. Louis. On August 12th, 2 days after the battle, the Confederates occupied Springfield. Price at once urged McCulloch to participate in an advance to the Missouri River. McCulloch, however, refused. He informed Price that his troops lacked ammunition. They were needed to protect Arkansas and the Indian Territory, and Pierce's division was about to return home, thereby leaving him with only 2,500 men. In addition, he argued that a movement to the Missouri could not succeed without the support of Hardee's and Pillow's armies, both of which, he had just learned, had fallen back toward the Arkansas line. McCulloch's reasons for opposing an advance to the Missouri were sincere and, except for the one concerning the protection of Arkansas and the Indian Territory, valid. But he had at least two others which he did not mention. The first was that, despite the bravery they had showed in the fighting on Bloody Hill, he still had no confidence in Price's troops, whose lack of discipline he feared would demoralize his own forces. The second was that he, along with many of the other non-Missourians, was disgusted with what he considered to be the selfish and unfriendly conduct of the State Guard. At the beginning of the campaign, Pierce loaned the Missourians 615 muskets. Only 10 were returned. In the marching up from Cassville, Parsons' division borrowed 95 tents left there along with spare clothing by the Louisiana Regiment. During the battle, Price's unarmed men picked up and kept the small arms of all the dead and wounded, including those of McCulloch's forces. And finally, Price's report on Wilson's Creek, published August 12th, was so worded that it appeared that his troops had captured Sigel's 5 cannons, whereas in fact they had been taken by the Louisianians. Little wonder, then, that McCulloch remarked in a letter to Hardee that we had as well be in Boston as far as the friendly feelings of the Missourians were concerned. McCulloch's response angered and disappointed Price, but it did not deter him. He was convinced that Missouri's hour of deliverance was at hand, and that not to take action now would only give the Federals a chance to recover from their defeat and more time to consolidate their hold on the state. He believed, too, that with his advance, the great mass of Missourians would rise up against the northern invaders, negating thereby the strictly military risks involved in the venture. Hence, on August 14th, he resumed independent command of the State Guard, which began preparing for the march to the Missouri. End quote. Meanwhile, Frémont scrambled to keep a hold on his district. At the moment, the Union military position in the state looked incredibly weak, and the inhabitants knew it. For any fence-sitters just looking to throw in with the winning side, Price and the Confederates looked like the appealing option right now after their victory at Wilson's Creek, especially when combined with whatever people out west might have known about First Manassas. In addition to that, you had thousands of Missourians feeling the sting of the Jayhawkers, and their best hope for ending that scourge would be for the Confederates to take control of the state and crack down on them. Frémont had to come up with something, and he did just that with a proclamation on August 30th, much to the chagrin of Lincoln. J. Monahan writes in Civil War on the Western Border, quote, "Word went out across the state and across the nation that Frémont had put Missouri under martial law. Men bearing arms without authority were to be court-martialed and shot. Slaves belonging to masters disloyal to the United States were to be freed. This Emancipation Proclamation, designed to quiet Missouri, excited the entire nation. The Northern abolition press praised Frémont's positive stand, but Lincoln, who wanted to hold the loyalty of other slaveholding border states, wrote privately to the Pathfinder, asking him to modify the decree's severity. M. Jeff Thompson, in the swamps of southeast Missouri, issued a counter-proclamation on September 2, 1861. He outdid his opponent by announcing that for every man executed under Frémont's order, he would hang, draw, and quarter a minion of said Abraham Lincoln. Then, to demonstrate his cruelty, the Swamp Fox promptly hanged a horse thief, forded a bayou saddle-skirt deep, dashed into the town of Charleston, took $56,000 from the bank to finance his further operations, and disappeared into the watery wastes of Mingo and Nigger Wool swamps. The national excitement and the renewed disturbances in eastern Missouri drew attention from Price's threatening advance in the west. On the day before M. Jeff Thompson replied to Frémont, the left wing of Price's army was spied by Lane's men on Drywood Creek east of Fort Scott. Montgomery's regiment skirmished with them and withdrew into Kansas. Price did not follow. He was interested only in repossessing Missouri. A few captured rebels told Lane that Old Pap was heading first for Lexington. End quote. That left wing of Price's army was, of course, the army that Lane mentioned in his dispatches back to Fort Leavenworth. But like Monahan says, Price wasn't interested in the Lane Brigade. He had bigger fish to fry, and Lane didn't have the strength to oppose Price's 10,000 men directly, so he settled for following in Price's wake and burning and pillaging all the secessionists in the area like we've been over. Now, on the national political scale, Lincoln had a real dilemma when it came to the border states. I want to re-emphasize that the conflict in Missouri and Frémont's Emancipation Proclamation was not just about slavery. It goes much deeper than that. Frémont himself used it as a political tool. It was meant to deter slave owners specifically from opposing the Union because it proclaimed that only the slaves of disloyal owners would be freed. But this was a bit of a ham-fisted attempt by Frémont because he failed to comprehend another piece of the political puzzle here. Remember that Unionist sentiment was strong in Missouri at the beginning of the war, even among many slave owners. Lincoln, from the beginning, had said his war aims were not to abolish slavery, but to keep the Union together. The abolition of slavery didn't become a war aim for him until much later. And so his primary goal with respect to Missouri would be to keep it and its people loyal to the Union. While Missourians, slave owners and otherwise, had been dealing with Kansas Jayhawkers for several years before the war, and were seeing a massive increase in that activity now. And Jayhawkers were, correctly or not, associated with abolitionists in the Missourian mind. So what do you think it does politically when Frémont makes this kind of emancipation proclamation for the state of Missouri? Well, it aligns Frémont for sure, and by extension the federal government that he represents, with abolitionism, and therefore with the Jayhawkers currently ravaging western Missouri. How do you think pro-slavery Missouri Unionists were going to react to that? In their minds, the federal government has now aligned itself with these robbers and pillagers and arsonists wrecking and destroying everything you've ever loved. How does that affect your loyalty to the federal government? I bet it doesn't help. Well, of course, the proclamation backfired and only added to the influx of new recruits to Price's army as he marched north. Unlike Frémont, Lincoln understood very well the political realities at play here and first asked Frémont to somehow lessen the severity of the decree, and when Frémont declined to do that, Lincoln pulled rank and canceled it himself. Between that, Wilson's Creek, and Price's advance, and the growing chaos in his department, Frémont seemed to be rapidly losing favor with Lincoln. Price marched north toward the Missouri River, intending to break the federal hold on the river, reunite the two halves of the state, and gather more recruits from secessionist partisans operating in the north. The place he chose to make his attack was Lexington, about 20 miles east of Kansas City as the crow flies, and one of the principal river towns of Missouri. Opposing him at Lexington would be another foreigner, an Irishman, Colonel James A. Mulligan, who headed up the river from Jefferson City with his Irish regiment. He joined his regiment to the garrison already at Lexington, which consisted of a regiment of Illinois cavalry and some Unionist militia, and was also joined by a regiment of Germans out of Kansas City. All of which added up to around 3,000 men, set to meet Price's army, which had swelled its ranks by now to something like 10 to 15,000. Being outnumbered so badly, Mulligan decided to dig in, abandoning most of the town and fortifying his army in a 17-acre area on the northwest side of town next to the river, around the Masonic College. Monahan writes, quote, "The elaborate work was hardly commenced on September 11, 1861, when Price's van appeared south of town, halted, deployed a guard, and bivouacked. All night, Mulligan's men worked feverishly with their spades. At dawn on September 12th, before the day shift took over the shovels, Colonel Peabody rode out with 3 companies, burned the bridge over which the Southerners must come, and fired at their encampment. The invaders withdrew, circled to the Independence Road from the west, and in the afternoon felt out the defenses on that side. To meet them, Mulligan sent out 6 companies, which opened fire from lanes and hedgerows. A Union battalion in the cemetery used the mounds and monuments as fortifications. Again, the enemy withdrew, but the Federal soldiers noticed new regiments coming in hourly from the south. During the afternoon, Henry Guibor, paroled at Camp Jackson, arrived with his battery, which had made a name for itself at Wilson's Creek. Taking position, he blazed away with grape and homemade canister at the hedgerows. One shell exploded near a group of Federal officers and sent them racing pell-mell into Lexington, where they drew rein, shamefacedly explaining that the noise had made their mounts unmanageable. Mulligan ordered a battery to reply to Guibor. A lucky shot hit one of his guns and exploded a caisson. Workmen threw down their shovels to cheer as the smoke mushroomed into the sky. Price had little ammunition in his van. He retired a 3rd time to establish camp at the fairgrounds and wait for his entire army before renewing the fight. Hundreds of country people came to town on horseback, in wagons, and on foot to watch the impending battle, to see the foreigners get licked. They crowded the streets as at fair time, packed the taverns, slept in livery stables and on the lawn before the ornate courthouse. On the morning of September 13, 1861, General Monroe M. Parsons sent a flag of truce to Mulligan. Parsons had started an active military career as a militia officer on the Missouri border in 1860. At Carthage and at Wilson's Creek, he had gained deserved recognition. Now, as commander of Price's van, he asked for a cessation of hostilities to permit removing the wounded. Parsons reminded Mulligan that a similar courtesy had been allowed the Federals at Wilson's Creek. The Irishman acquiesced. End quote. Mulligan's delaying attacks held Price up long enough for the fortifications to be finished. But with supplies already running low, he could only hope to hold out long enough to be relieved by columns of 3,500 men under John Pope and 2,200 under Samuel Sturgis coming in from the northwest under orders from Frémont. Price was apparently in no big hurry, and it took until September 17th to bring up the rest of the ammunition for his artillery and move into position for an assault on the college grounds. In those few days, the town was evacuated and houses were demolished to clear fields of fire for the artillery, while Price's men surrounded the college grounds completely and cut Mulligan off from the river, which was his only source of water. Monahan continues, quote, "At 10 a.m. on September 18th, with the sun beating down mercilessly, Price opened with 16 guns. The concussion broke windows in town. Hiram Bledsoe had been wounded at Drywood and was not present, but the dull boom of Old Sacramento was recognized by many people who had heard it thunder here in Lexington on many a 4th of July. Under the bombardment, General Rains moved his men forward, and as he passed the batteries, he offered a gold medal to the artilleryman who could shoot down the flag on the battlement ahead. Then, turning to an aide, he sent out word that the descending banner would be the cue for a general assault, which would put his men ahead of any other division. Optimistic braggadocio, for the flag was still flying at mid-morning. Over on the river, the thin line of skirmishers complained about shots coming from a brick building 250 yards outside the Federal battlements. A hospital flag flew from the structure, so it had been spared. Now a few rebel companies organized under the riverbank to rush and capture the hospital. At a given signal, they scrambled up the slope, through weeds tall as a man. Here and there, hidden mines exploded, wounding some. The rebels skipped over or around the smoking craters and stormed in the hospital's main entrance, up a circular stair and down the halls. The building was a hospital, truly enough, with many sick and wounded in cots on the second floor, and in the basement a pack of huddled slaves. But the snipers had hidden or escaped. From the balcony and from roof gutters, the invaders looked down into the college fortifications. What a place for sharpshooters to pick off Union soldiers! Mulligan, watching from the college, saw that the hospital must be retaken if possible. He called for volunteers. The men looked at the 250 yards of open ground between them and the well-defended building, with no cover but wildflowers. None volunteered. Mulligan strode down before his Montgomery guards. He owed his success in politics and in war to fluent oratory, and now he delivered the speech of his life. Frankly, he said that the building must be taken, and that he was asking his guards to do what others had refused to consider. Would they go? The Irishmen cheered, eager for the chance. A company of Peabody's Germans asked to go with them. The assault party rallied behind the sally port. Officers, about to die perhaps, drew their swords, and the companies marched out at quick step, formed in line, and started at double time. Finally, as the distance shortened, they broke into a mad rush. Shots from the hospital sprawled some of the men among the weeds, but the survivors stormed in the door and up the stairs, shooting over the cots at fleeing figures in the wings. 3 trapped Southerners surrendered and were bayoneted while under guard. Another climbed in bed with a wounded Illinois soldier and thus saved himself until the furor subsided. Almost exhausted from the charge and from the stifling heat in the hospital, the victors, finding no drinking water, fought among themselves for swigs from the bloody buckets used by surgeons to wash wounds. Thus disorganized and desperate, they were unprepared for the counterattack which drove them back to their fortifications at dark." End quote. The first day of assaults ended with no real progress on either side beyond the secessionist capture of the hospital. Mulligan didn't know it yet, but the relief columns weren't coming. Pope and Sturgis were both approaching from the north side of the river and would have to cross to get to Lexington on the south side, and apparently each was unaware of the location of the other. So while their combined strength was close to 6,000 men, they had no communications and no way to coordinate, and when slaves tipped them off that the secessionists held the nearby river crossings and might be waiting to ambush them, they just turned aside and gave up Lexington and its defenders to the enemy. A sudden rainstorm on the morning of September 19th brought temporary relief to the Union defenders who were completely out of water by now and feeling the pain of thirst. Price's artillery kept pounding the Federals and Mulligan's artillery answered back. Monahan continues, quote, "Mulligan knew nothing about the failure of the relief columns. Big guns pounded endlessly at his fortifications, geysers of sticks and dirt spraying along the line. Several incendiary hotshot thumped into the college rooms. Men with shovels saved the building by throwing the hot balls out the windows. Meanwhile, the Federals' bombardment set several houses in town on fire. One cannonball chipped away part of a column on the courthouse. Price's men laughed at a farmer volunteer who joined their lines with gun and dinner pail. Taking a position in sight of the parapet, he shot every head he could see above the embankment until noon, then retired, ate lunch, smoked his pipe, and returned to the grisly job. Another citizen volunteered a novel idea to end the siege. Why not advance to the enemy position behind immovable breastworks of hemp bales? Price thought the device worth trying, and wagons lined up before warehouses. All afternoon, bales were hauled down to the river to be drenched, then up the hill to the hospital. During the night of September 19, 1861, the bales were arranged like a wall extending in two wings from the brick building. Next morning, the Federals saw a dark barrier lying like a snake across the ridges and hollows. As they watched, the line twitched and moved forward, crushing down weeds and sunflowers. It parted for trees and joined together after passing them. Men with levers were obviously prying the line forward. Sputtering rifles warned the Federals to beware. Mulligan called up his artillery and ordered hot shot fired at the twitching line, but the wet bales did not burn. Occasionally a direct hit sent a bundle bouncing, but the gap was quickly filled. Absalom Grimes of the Rawls County Rangers, in action now, reported seeing a captain knocked flat by the impact of a cannonball against the hemp bale he was hiding behind, but most hits rocked the compressed bundles harmlessly. Mulligan sent out a few daredevils to charge the line, but they failed to take it. Nothing he could do stopped the slow and relentless advance. Sudden shouting at another part of the line attracted Mulligan's attention. At several places, white flags appeared, contrary to his orders. Price sent over a courier to arrange the truce. Mulligan sent him back, saying that he knew of no white flag unless Price had raised it. Then, on inquiry, Mulligan learned that one of his majors, who had twice been threatened with death if he dared surrender, had waved a handkerchief on a ramrod. Other discouraged men had done likewise. There was no doubt about the offer to surrender. Mulligan called his top officers together and asked their decision. They voted to quit the fight, 4 against 2. The Irishman dispatched the verdict to Price, and all firing ceased. Price acknowledged the surrender and asked why the United States flag was not hauled down. Mulligan replied that his Irishman had nailed it to the pole. This satisfied the serene and white-haired Price. He ordered troops formed for the capitulation. All enemy muskets were to be stacked. Officers and men were to keep sidearms, personal property, and horses. Magnanimous provisions typical of Price. End quote. Casualties were relatively light, due to most of the fighting at Lexington having been done from behind strong fortifications. Unless, of course, you count the captured, which amounted to the entire surviving Union garrison. Castell sums up the battle like this, quote, "At Lexington, Price achieved the outstanding victory of his career. It had been made possible by his own daring and determination, by the courage and inventiveness of his soldiers, and by the ineptitude and confusion of the Federal commanders in Missouri, who were unable to concentrate a sufficient force either to prevent his advance, rescue Mulligan, or sever his communications. Besides nearly 3,500 Union troops, his army captured 7 cannons, over 3,000 desperately needed rifles, 750 horses, and a large quantity of other items, including sabers, saddles, and commissary stores. In so doing, it inflicted 159 casualties and suffered less than 100. It was, moreover, the most complete success gained so far by a Confederate army, one made all the more spectacular by the ingenious device of the hemp bales. Coming on the heels of Wilson's Creek, it made Price a popular hero in the South and gave him a lasting hold on the confidence and esteem of pro-Confederate Missourians. But, unfortunately, it also gave him an exaggerated opinion of his own military abilities and led him to underestimate the hazards involved in assaulting fortified positions." End quote. The fall of Lexington was another blow to the reputation and standing of Frémont, and at this point, he was on very thin ice with Lincoln. Monahan wraps up his account of the siege like this, quote, "The North wailed over the defeat louder than it had after Wilson's Creek. Frémont was accused of sacrificing Mulligan as he did Lyon the previous month. Critics complained that he had 25,000 men available in 10 days to get them to Lexington, a statement ignoring the necessity of troops in other theaters. The fact remains, however, that Frémont failed to force available troops under Sturgis, Pope, and Prince at Fort Leavenworth to strike Price in the rear and divert him from the siege. Perhaps the Pathfinder's mind was overly harassed by the quarrel with Blair, for during the height of the battle at Lexington, he arrested his old family friend. Critics also asked what had become of Senator Jim Lane and his new kind of warfare which had promised so much in this emergency. End quote. We know very well what Lane's new kind of warfare was, and what it meant for the people of western Missouri. As for Price, his occupation of Lexington was short-lived, and he retreated south only 10 days after the siege ended. It turns out that taking territory is one thing, but holding it long-term is quite a different thing. Price just didn't have the manpower or supplies to maintain anything like a permanent presence this far into Missouri. Like I said before, Price and his army were officially not yet part of the regular Confederate military. They were Missouri State Militia. To maintain himself on the Missouri River, Price would need substantial support from the regular Confederate Army, and he wasn't getting it. He'd had so many new recruits coming in that he couldn't arm and supply them all, and he started having to turn them away. Besides that, he was still drastically outnumbered strategically, and when word came that Frémont was marching with an army of 38,000 to cut off his retreat and trap him on the Missouri, he decided he had no choice but to retreat. Castell writes, quote, "On September 29th, the State Guard marched out of Lexington. By the time it reached the Osage River 9 days later, it had dwindled through desertions to a mere 7,000, nearly 13,000 fewer than its peak strength immediately after Mulligan's surrender. Instead of a great campaign of liberation, the march to the Missouri had been merely a raid, and the triumph at Lexington, however dramatic, had proved strategically barren. As one of Price's officers later observed, the brutal truth of the matter was that the sentiment of Missouri was not in harmony with the secession movement, and that even those who sympathized with the Confederate cause were more interested in the conservation of their property and scalps than an abstract principle. Price, however, refused to admit this fact, even to himself, but remained convinced that if he could only hold on long enough in central Missouri, a popular uprising against federal rule would take place. In his mind, two men were to blame for the failure of the campaign: McCulloch for not supporting it, and Jefferson Davis for his general policy regarding Missouri." End quote. Frémont's pursuit was anything but energetic, and Price's retreat was likewise fairly leisurely. I'm going to read you another section from Monahan's book about what this retreat was like, and this is one of those things that I think takes on a different meaning when you put it into its context. I'll just read it first and explain what I mean afterwards. Here's Monahan. Quote, "Pro-slavery farmers along the road greeted the column hospitably, treated them to pitchers of cold buttermilk from their spring houses, invited them to join games and dances. Most of the volunteers followed old Pap with childlike devotion. They wrote home about their patriotic emotions, whistled at the girls in country towns, and shouted at those who waved from farm porches. Private Grimes described a jolly church social down near the famous battlefield of Carthage. In a game called King's Chair, one of Absalom's comrades volunteered to be it. He was ushered into a room full of people who could hardly keep their faces straight. The gallant volunteer was asked to sit down on what appeared to be a sheet-covered bench between two very pretty girls. As a matter of fact, there was no bench. The girls were sitting on opposite ends of a sheet stretched over a washtub between two stools. As the soldier sat down, the girls stood up amid shouts of merriment as the victim jackknifed into the water. Ab Grimes laughed until his sides ached. Then another game was suggested. A charming brunette offered to wager Ab a kiss against a dime that he could not balance her ring on his forehead and toss it into a funnel in his belt. Ab felt confident that he could win the bet, but let him tell what happened. Quoting Grimes now. "When my head was pushed back, one of those sweet, gentle girls whom I had admired so highly poured a half-gallon dipper of cold water into that funnel. There was but one place for the water to go, and it went there without delay. Back to Monahan. Next day, the boys marched away, their heads dizzy with memories of laughing feminine faces. In the evening, Ab and his friends met more Confederates marching south by another road. Both columns exchanged funny experiences and trudged on together. End quote. Now that sounds like a nice little respite from the horrors of war, a little bit of lightness and merriment in the midst of a terrible situation. And it is those things. But as I read that, I can't help but think of what's coming for all the civilians here at the hands of men like Jennison, Lane, and Montgomery because they were friendly with secessionists. How many of these people will be homeless by the time winter comes around? How many won't make it through the winter? I don't know, but that thought puts a bit of a darker spin on all that fun, doesn't it? Now, as much as Price may have disliked McCulloch, the Confederate government was not blind to the importance of Missouri in the war, and neither were the secessionists within the Missouri government blind to the necessity of aligning themselves officially with the Confederacy. Price's retreat ended at Neosho in the far southwest corner of Missouri on October 20th, and then Jackson held a session of as much of the legislature as he could scrape together who were still loyal to him. They defied the Missouri Convention and passed a secession bill, signaling their position clearly to the Confederate government, and in November, the Confederate Congress counted Missouri as its 12th state. It's worth pausing for a minute to explain this. So, officially, the Confederacy only ever had 11 states, and Missouri is not usually counted as one of them. That's because this secession ordinance was never considered legal by the Union, or historians, or really anyone outside of Missouri and the Confederacy. I've referred to the convention a couple of times, and that was a special body elected by the Missouri legislature in early 1861, specifically to decide on the question of secession for Missouri. Under the provisions they put in place, only the convention had the legal authority to secede. The legislature itself did not have that authority. The convention had already voted to remain in the Union and actually deposed Jackson and replaced him as governor with the Unionist Hamilton Gamble. All that, plus the fact that there wasn't even a quorum at this rump session of the legislature in Neosho, meant that this secession ordinance was never recognized by the U.S. government, which still considered Missouri part of the Union. So the reason that matters at all is that it meant the Confederate government was now going to be more willing to send its own armies into Missouri and offer military support to the secessionists. And as a result, Price's state militia began to be transferred into the Confederate Army. So from this point forward, there won't be any more of this ambiguity as far as Price and his men are concerned. They're just going to be Confederates now. While this was happening, Frémont was trying to salvage his own position within the Union Army. The Union suffered another embarrassing defeat back east on October 21st at Ball's Bluff, which was smaller and less costly in material terms than Bull Run, but was another serious blow to morale. It was such an embarrassing defeat that some in Congress suspected that a conspiracy to betray the Union might be in the works, and the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War was formed to investigate such things. I can't imagine that the gloomy strategic picture was making Lincoln any more patient. The fact was, like I said before, Frémont was on very thin ice with Lincoln after Wilson's Creek and Lexington. He was feuding with the Unionist leader Frank Blair, and Lincoln was, in fact, already planning to relieve him. Monahan writes in Civil War on the Western Border, quote, "Only one thing could save Frémont. He must win a smashing military victory. His army, after 3 months' training, was in the pink of condition, so Frémont thought. He wrote Winfield Scott, the commanding general in Washington, "I am taking the field myself, and hope to destroy the enemy either before or after the junction of forces under McCulloch. Please notify the President immediately." But Lincoln had already made up his mind that Frémont was unsuited for this job. Scott replied tersely that Lincoln expects you to repair the disaster at Lexington without loss of time. The President also sent Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas and Secretary of War Simon Cameron to St. Louis with a signed order for Frémont's removal. Frémont knew that they were coming, and when they arrived in St. Louis, he had left to join his army. Just before boarding the train for Jefferson City, he had rearrested Frank Blair. Frémont's army of 40,000 men was distributed in 5 divisions with planned supply lines at strategic points across Missouri. General David Hunter's division headquartered at Versailles. John Pope went to Boonville, Franz Sigel to Sedalia, Asboth to the terminus of the Pacific Railroad at Tipton, John McKinstry to Syracuse. The 5 divisions were all in communication and could work together. In addition, Senator Lane and Brigadier General of Volunteers Sturgis had approximately 5,000 men on the Kansas border. Such an army should be able to defeat anything Price could muster, but the campaign had flaws. Elderly General Hunter, Lincoln's aide on his inaugural trip to Washington, had personal ambitions which might be helped by Frémont's failure. John Pope had been quietly thwarting the Pathfinder all summer, and his failure to relieve Lexington still rankled the general's heart. McKinstry had been accused of diverting the few available reinforcements from Lyon at Wilson's Creek, an oversight at the root of Frémont's unfortunate situation. Lane, on the border, was always undependable to the point of insubordination. He might appeal orders directly to the people. Only the foreigners, Sigel and Asboth, seemed completely loyal, and it was at Asboth's headquarters in Tipton that General Thomas and Secretary Cameron overtook Frémont. Fall rains had made the roads almost impassable, but the inspectors found Frémont's engineers prepared to bridge or corduroy as required. The efficient Pathfinder had anticipated every emergency, and the soldiers' morale was high. They merrily promised themselves Thanksgiving dinner in Memphis and Christmas in New Orleans. Subordinate officers praised their commander and pronounced his emancipation the quickest way to restore loyalty in Missouri. Secretary of War Cameron showed Frémont the order for his removal. The Pathfinder begged for time to demonstrate the power of his army after months of training. Cameron agreed to give them a chance, put the order back in his pocket, and returned to Washington, but Thomas published a scathing report which delighted the Blairs. 15 of Frémont's ranking officers sent a round-robin letter to Lincoln commending their commander. Left to himself again, Frémont ordered a general advance. His 5 columns were close enough to consolidate within 24 hours in case resistance was encountered. On the Osage, below the charred remains of Osceola, the bridge was gone. Frémont's expert technicians constructed a new 800-foot span in 36 hours, and the column continued. New Orleans and home again by summer, soldiers shouted with glee, but Frémont, in spite of his men's military confidence, knew that personal enemies were plotting constantly against him. Worrying about these conspiracies, but outwardly calm, he rode beside his 10-year-old son, who dressed gaily in the full Uhlan uniform of the Guard. Bayonets and sabers radiated from the presence. The air behind him was fragrant with the smell of shoe polish and saddle soap. This pageantry appealed to his military followers, but farmers along the road and volunteers in his army who had enlisted to uphold democracy began to feel that Price's simplicity was more American. On October 24, 1861, the elaborate column came within 60 miles of Springfield. Rumor said that the rebel legislature was in session down there, and that Price guarded the place with only 400 men. October 25th was the anniversary of the charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava. Major Zagoni asked permission for the Guard to celebrate the great day by a surprise attack on the rebel capital. His men were eager to belie their reputation as parlor pets in fancy uniforms and kid gloves. Even their glossy horses had been pointed out as toys. End quote. Major Charles Zagoni was a Hungarian who had served in the Revolutionary Army during his home country's 1848 revolt, and he now commanded Frémont's personal bodyguard of cavalrymen. It turned out Price had 1,000 men in Springfield, not 400, and Zagoni's guards, combined with about 200 more cavalry scouts, only added up to some 350 men. Still, Zagoni hoped to catch the rebels by surprise. At dawn on October 25th, Zagoni's men surprised a small foraging party separated from the main body and took them all prisoner, except one who escaped and made it back to Springfield, ruining their element of surprise. Even so, Zagoni went ahead with his plan to attack all on his own. Instead of taking the most direct route to Springfield and coming in from the north, as would be expected, he circled around and approached from the west, hoping to at least keep the surprise of coming in from an unexpected direction. What followed was a somewhat foolish but surprisingly successful cavalry charge. Traditional military wisdom has it that to ensure a successful attack, the attacking force should outnumber the defenders at least 3-1, and in this case that ratio was reversed. But nevertheless, Zagoni's men routed the rebels with minimal losses of their own and occupied Springfield. They were helped by the fact that the defenders were raw recruits of the Missouri State Guard, untrained and not yet transferred into regular Confederate service. This battle was also completely pointless. Zagoni was something like a day's ride out ahead of Frémont's main body, which contained some 40,000 men and would have been able to easily overwhelm the Springfield defenders. Knowing that he wouldn't be able to hold the town against a counterattack if the rebels regrouped, Zagoni retreated almost immediately after occupying Springfield and went right back to the main body. But the pointlessness of it was not going to stop Frémont from celebrating it and playing it up for the sake of salvaging his own career, and the northern public was ready to eat it up too, as starved for a victory as they were by this point. Monahan continues, quote, Frémont, with his vast army, came on at a slower pace, entering Springfield 2 days later without opposition. The general sent heroic dispatches announcing a great victory. Atonement at last for Bull Run, Wilson's Creek, Lexington, and Ball's Bluff. Surely this would offset the criticism being poured constantly into Lincoln's ears. Establishing headquarters in the brick building formerly occupied by Lyon, Frémont watched his army divisions march in, day and night. Lane and Sturgis both arrived from Kansas. The grim chieftain's men were loaded with plunder, and hundreds of freed Negroes loafed around his camp. A great city of tents sheltering over 30,000 men rose around Springfield. Smoke from thousands of campfires floated in Indian summer haze above the treetops. Members of the Guard prowled up and down the slope where they had made their charge, telling and retelling personal experiences. Frémont renewed his magnificent parades. Frank Blair and his threats seemed far away. With the Guard, resplendent as imperial Uhlans, the Pathfinder rode out to Wilson's Creek battlefield. He had at last retrieved the territory won by the ragged little captain. The key to Missouri now lay once more in federal hands. Price, down at Neosho, 80 miles away, tried feebly to maintain his government by firing a 100-gun salute to announce the convening of the rebel legislature. Both houses lacked quorums, but with alleged proxies, an ordinance of secession was passed, and General Rains was elected to the Confederate Senate. Price, still quarreling with McCulloch, urged him to come to Missouri and help fight Frémont. The Texan insisted that the Pathfinder be lured into Arkansas. In the open country north and east of Pea Ridge, the Federals might be trapped and annihilated. Frémont, in Springfield, understood the game being played against him. He knew that Price had insufficient men to strike alone, and that many of them would refuse to leave the state and fight in Arkansas. Thus the two armies could be fought separately. Everything seemed to be turning to his advantage. On the evening of November 2, 1861, Frémont's plans were suddenly changed. All his divisions but Hunter's had come in. Frémont sat writing at a long table in his tent when a messenger presented himself and delivered a letter. The general frowned as he read it. Then the messenger ripped an order that had been sewed in his coat and handed it to Frémont. The general glanced at the paper, slammed it on the table, glared at the courier, and demanded, "Sir, how did you get admission into my lines?" Frémont called in his division commanders and showed them the order relieving him of command and appointing General Hunter, who had not yet arrived, in his place. Lincoln, with characteristic caution, had sent the order with instructions that it be withheld in case Frémont had fought a winning battle, was in personal command in battle, or was in the immediate presence of an enemy. General Asboth offered to resign at once. Sigel did too, then changed his mind. Another retreat. Osterhaus ground the point of his scabbard into the gravel. Soon the news spread through the camp. Soldiers raged with resentment. As schoolboys, they had been taught to revere the great explorer and refused to see him deposed. Indignation meetings were called around open fires. Officers who had been quarreling over military preferment forgot their differences. Whole companies threatened to throw down their arms. A dozen bands began to serenade Frémont, all at the same time. General Frémont ordered the bands hushed. The men must submit. During the evening, 110 officers, including every brigadier, came to Frémont's tent. They begged to be led against the enemy at once, and thus invalidate the order. Frémont agreed to wait one more day for Hunter. Then, if he had not appeared, they would march. All next day, plans were drawn up for a battle. Lyon's tactics at Wilson's Creek were to be repeated. Sigel and Lane were to circle and attack from the rear. Asboth would march in from the east, McKinstry and Pope from the north. Soldiers rehearsed for this movement, actually believed that the enemy had come and a battle was imminent. But the Pathfinder knew better. End quote. Hunter made it to Springfield that night and officially took over command from Frémont, but with no pressing urgency to fight a battle for the sake of saving his career, he quickly learned that there was no enemy force within striking distance and abandoned Springfield on November 8th, falling back in the direction of St. Louis. Lane's brigade was dismissed to go back to Kansas, burning and looting to their heart's content all the way. Unionists in the region anticipated the backlash that would come in the wake of Lane and the other Jayhawkers. Monahan writes, quote, "Union people along the way knew that the Southerners would take revenge on their farms. For self-protection, they joined the columns by hundreds. Other refugees flocked to St. Louis ahead of the army. Men, barefooted and in smocks, women shivering with children under dirty shawls, claimed to have been driven from their cabins by the rebels. With this pitiful horde came news of Hunter's retreat, and some St. Louisans prophesied a collapse of federal authority. Wealthy women even dared drive downtown displaying Confederate flags in their carriage windows." End quote. Price and McCulloch didn't find out about the retreat until a week later and tried to pursue by a forced cavalry march, but by the time they got to Springfield, the Federals were long gone. Price fell back to the vicinity of the burned-out husk of Osceola and settled in for the winter. Enlistments were expiring soon for most of his Missouri militiamen, and even though most of those were willing to re-enlist, they wanted furloughs first to go home and take whatever steps they could to ensure the safety of their families and property, and so it would be some time before Price was able to take any offensive action again. But that didn't stop him from dreaming up offensives. Castell writes in his book on Price, quote, "Price believed that if he could establish himself in strength on the Missouri during the winter, his numbers would be indefinitely increased. Hence on December 6th he wrote McCulloch, who had retreated again to Arkansas, asking him to cooperate in such a movement. McCulloch, however, did not receive Price's letter. He had just left for Richmond to defend his conduct of operations in the West from the criticisms of Price's friends in the capital. The answer came instead from McIntosh, now a colonel and commanding in McCulloch's absence. McIntosh declared that his troops were needed in Arkansas, and that in any case they were not adequately equipped or clothed to march in the depth of winter over the bleak prairies of Missouri. And for good measure he added, "The facility with which the enemy could concentrate a force on the Missouri River renders such a project at this season of the year almost madness." It is easy to see why Price inspired contempt in professionals such as McIntosh. Too often his military proposals, as in this instance, were utterly impractical. However, in his defense it can be said that at least he wanted to do something, instead of constantly finding reasons for doing nothing, as did McCulloch and McIntosh. Also, he realized, as these officers apparently did not, that the war in Missouri was as much political and psychological in character as it was military, and that consequently it might sometimes be necessary to take great military risks in order to arouse or at least keep alive the spirit of opposition to Union dominion. Finally, it should be kept in mind that he had not favored secession originally and had drawn the sword solely to defend his own state against what he deemed Northern invasion. And although he now supported the Confederacy, his primary interest was and ever remained most passionately Missouri. End quote. Well, it would turn out that the Unionist refugees following in the wake of the Federal columns on the retreat were right to be concerned about a Southern backlash to the depredations of the Jayhawkers. Because the winter of 1861 to 62 would see the rise of a new breed of savage on the Kansas-Missouri border. One of the earliest incidents of secessionist bushwhacking was in December of 1861, when a Missouri guerrilla named John Clem led his band up Mine Creek, killing at least 3 Jayhawkers and reclaiming property that he considered to have been stolen from Missouri. At the village of Potosi, in the neighborhood of the modern-day town of Pleasanton, they came upon the home of a man named Joseph Seawright. Seawright's daughter wrote about what happened. Quote, "It was a bright moonlight night, almost like daylight. After retiring, my mother heard shooting. When she heard this, she tried to induce my father to leave the house and go to where my brother Isaac and his brother-in-law were hiding, but he was not well physically, having chills and fever, and after arising and dressing, remarked he was feeling so badly he did not care to lay out in the cold and damp, and perhaps they would not come. So he lay down on the bed fully dressed. The next thing we knew, they were pounding on the door for admittance. As soon as Mother opened the door, they rushed in and filled the room, middle-aged men and a lot of boys not over 12 or 14 years of age. Mother asked, 'Who are you?' They replied, 'We are Texas Rangers.' My father in the meantime had stepped into a side kitchen. There seemed to be 2 leaders in the gang. One stood at the bedside of my sister-in-law, who was recovering from a serious siege of pneumonia, and prevented others from stealing bed covers from her bed. All other blankets, quilts, coverlids, etc. were taken by them. A part of the crowd going into the kitchen discovered my father, bringing him back into the room, thence out into the yard. As they brought him through the room, my mother said, 'Surely you would not hurt him?' The other leader answering, 'Not one hair of his head shall be injured.' By this time they had taken all they wanted from the house and now departed, all mounting, riding off, except one. My father yet standing in the door. The man left behind threw his gun over the saddle as if in the act of mounting, pointed toward our father, shooting him, killing him almost instantly. After he did this, he mounted, and as he was riding away, a man came rushing back, asking angrily, 'Why in hell did you do that? Didn't I order you not to shoot?' End quote. As the inevitable reprisals for all the jayhawking ramped up, one bushwhacker in Missouri would come to stand head and shoulders above the rest in both effectiveness and notoriety. He'd already made something of a name for himself by the time the war got started. He wasn't originally a Missourian at all. He'd come to Kansas from Ohio and was reportedly a Free Stater when he first got there. But in 1859, shortly after the hanging of John Brown, he wrote in a letter to his mother back home, quote, "You have undoubtedly heard of the wrongs committed in this territory by the Southern people, or pro-slavery party, but when one once knows the facts, they can easily see that it has been the opposite party that have been the main movers in the troubles, and by far the most lawless set of people in the country. They all sympathize for old J. Brown, who should have been hung years ago. Indeed, hanging was too good for him. May I never see a more contemptible people than those who sympathize for him. A murderer and a robber, made a martyr of. Just think of it." End quote. In December of 1860, a month before Kansas gained statehood, the 23-year-old Charlie Hart took a step that would permanently separate him from the Free Soil Party align him with the Southern cause, and set him on a path to infamy. He joined 3 other Jayhawkers for a raid on the plantation of Morgan Walker near Blue Springs, Missouri, just outside Kansas City. But it was a double cross. Hart had already been in contact with Walker and his son Andrew and had set the other 3 Jayhawkers up for an ambush. When they got to the Walker house, Hart stepped in the door to speak to the Walkers and left the other 3 standing on the porch. Andrew Walker tells us what happened next. Quote, "My father replied that if his niggers wanted to go to Kansas, they were at liberty to do so, but he did not see any reason why those who did not want to go should be compelled to leave him, and he thought he ought to have his stock and money left him. The other 3 were standing outside the door, which was then shut. A candle was put in the window, and the other lights turned out. We then opened fire on the 3. Goodrich continues in War to the Knife. In the blaze of buckshot that swept the yard, one abolitionist dropped dead, while another helped his wounded comrade into the night. The respite was brief. A Negro servant of my father's saw them in the brush a few days later, concluded young Walker. My father and I shouldered our guns and went after them, and they were buried right there. For his role in the affair at Morgan Walker's, the stranger was awarded a horse, $100, and a warm welcome to his new home and new life in Missouri." End quote. Charlie Hart, like Lane, Brown, or Montgomery, was many things to many people. To some, he became a folk hero, a protector and deliverer from the Jayhawker menace. To others, he was a monster, a ghostly specter that would materialize out of some wooded ravine and wreak havoc among Unionists and their sympathizers, only to melt away into the brush and disappear as quickly as he came. To still others, he was a sacker of cities and ruthless killer to be compared with Genghis Khan and the Mongol hordes of the ancient steppe. If you're from Kansas or Missouri, you almost certainly know who I'm talking about because he's infamous to this day. But you might be a little confused by the name Charlie Hart, because you don't know him by that name. Charlie Hart is the name he was using when he showed up in Lawrence in the spring of 1860. But you know him by the name he was using when he became the most notorious bushwhacker in Missouri. You know him by the name William Clark Quantrill. We'll talk plenty more about Quantrill in the next few episodes, as well as a host of other bushwhackers, not the least of which was variously one of Quantrill's lieutenants and the leader of his own gang. A man just as ruthless, just as violent, and nearly as notorious as Quantrill himself.
Name's Anderson. Bloody Bill's what they call me. Redlegs? You'll find them up in Kansas. They're with the Union. We're going up there and set things right.
I'll be coming with you.
Now, I know I'm leaving you on a little bit of a cliffhanger with that ending, and I really do apologize for this, but I'm going to have to leave you in suspense on that thread for a little while longer. Because in the next episode, we're going to take a bit of a detour. It's a detour that I've debated on whether to include in this series or not, but at the end of the day, I've decided to go ahead with it for a couple of reasons. One, because it forms a sort of tributary stream, if you will, to the main storyline of this series. I don't think it's necessarily essential to understanding what goes on in our main story, but it will add some depth and complexity and color to what's going on, and I think it's worth including for that reason alone. The second reason is that it's a story that deserves to be told, and needs to be told, and doesn't get nearly the kind of attention that other stories from the Civil War get. And because, after all, I called this show the Unsung Podcast, it seems like exactly the kind of story I should be telling here. I'll elaborate on both of those reasons next time, but for now the point is, the next episode is going to be a bit of a detour, but don't worry, we'll get to Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson soon enough. One other note before I wrap this one up. I've come to a realization lately as we've gotten into the war proper. We're at or near the midpoint of the story now. I really do enjoy writing and recording these things, and I think I've been moving along at a pretty good clip so far as upload schedule goes. I don't have a set schedule for publishing these, but they've been going out on average at the rate of about an episode every month or two, which has been made possible by the fact that I front-loaded a lot of the research for the Kansas Territorial period before I released the first episode. But the downside to releasing episodes as fast as I have been is that my releases have now outpaced my research. Now, I have a decent bit of background knowledge on the Civil War already, but frankly I need much deeper study to put out these episodes. I have a general outline in my head of what happens in Missouri throughout the war, but I have not yet researched this part of the story coming up as deeply as I have the Kansas Territorial period. And I do want to research it more deeply because I don't want the whole show to just be me reading firsthand accounts of guerrilla raids and quotes from Thomas Goodrich ad nauseum. I am focused primarily on the guerrilla war, but I do still want to follow the larger scale military operations in this part of the country and show you how those interact with the guerrilla war and how the two influence each other. So the point of saying all that is I have a lot more reading to do before I'm confident to do justice to this next part of the story coming up, and for that reason, the pace of new episode release is likely going to slow down quite a bit in the coming months. I will get them out as fast as I can, but like I said, I have a lot of reading to do and I want to do the story justice. Also, this isn't my day job. I do have a full-time job outside of doing this, and I have a family to take care of, so I have to work on this when I have time. So we will likely slow down quite a bit, but rest assured we will get through it, and hopefully by the end we will have learned something useful from all the carnage. With all that being said, thank you again for listening. Check out the Substack if you haven't, and maybe consider subscribing. And I hope you'll join me again for the next one, that the deeds of men shall not go unsung.